Hi everyone, thanks so much for coming. It's lovely to see so many faces here on our first research and monitoring showcase. So I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping and then pass over to our director, Mike Waite. So just to start with, the toilets are the essentials, are just out of these doors and turn right, and they should just be on the right, just in there. In the case of a fire, which there shouldn't be, the fire assembly point is just outside the hub. So if you leave the building the way you came in and turn left, just walk until you see a great big sign that says the hub. It's a great big building. This event is actually being recorded, so if anybody has any problems with recording, please come and let me know. Or Billy at the end. Billy, can you give us a wave? Can you go and give Billy a shout and just have a chat with her? So I'm going to pass over to our director, Mike Waite.
Thank you, Vicky. Thanks very much. Everybody hear me all right? I'm a bit quiet voice, best of times. Yeah, so I'm Mike Waite. I'm the Director of Research and Monitoring at Surrey Wildlife Trust. And welcome to our showcase event to present research collaboration opportunities that we've forged over the last couple of years with local academic institutions. Got to press two things to advance these now. So it's fair to say that the trust it's central to the trust's what we call our MEMS and arts, our charitable raison d'etre, that we've always been involved with research. But it's only in the last couple of years that we've actually formed our little research and monitoring team, with me as director, to be more proactive at meeting the approaches from that we've always had from academia to work out what research questions we might need answering at the trust, that then we can suggest to people. It used to be far more ad hoc. People would come along and can I use your reserve to do this and that? And we'd say, yeah, fine. And not necessarily get the results of their research or what have you. But yes, we've upscaled and made it a far more prominent part of our mission at the moment. So we've got this there we are. We've got this justification on our website, and that pretty much summarizes what I was just trying to précis. So science is at the heart of our decision making. We strive to use the scientific evidence to inform both our policy and our actions. So that's the mission. And in 2019, we published this. I wrote this, the Research and Monitoring Framework. There's copies available out there of this. We've got plenty of them. Still got boxes of them, in fact, trying to get rid of them. But so do help yourself to several copies if you want. Yeah, this kind of lays out what the recent history of research and monitoring in the county of Surrey, and then especially at the back. We were running to our 5-year strategy at the time, the Trust's 5-year strategy, and it set out a monitoring methodology to monitor the progress on that. So what we thought to make this more structural proactivity work, to meet people coming to us saying, I'd like to do research on your estate, we thought, well, let's publish a research prospectus. And we've now, I think we're on our 3rd prospectus now, and it's reviewed every year. We consult across the whole of the trust to get everybody's in good time, to get everybody's thoughts on what they would like to get, questions that they'd like to have answered, especially in estate management, very practical applications like that. And we review this to sort of coincide with the academic year starting. And this year we've got these 6 themes that you've been looking at now for a couple of minutes, so you can see how that works. They're broad themes, and there's lots of flex in that for people to think of their own research questions. And what a theatre for research Surrey is, really. That's why I put this slide up. It's, you know, it's a very rich county. We might be landlocked, but it's certainly a very, very biodiverse county. We've got we are the UK's most densely wooded county, so we're told. There's 13% of the UK's lowland heathland in Surrey, and the Surrey Hills National Landscape, and much more besides. Surrey has a very rich biodiversity, and it's well recorded. It's one of the reasons for that. Well, one of the reasons underlying that, we've had we are historically very well recorded, and it's certainly very rich, our biodiversity. The team has been of late designing a methodology for monitoring what the wildlife trusts are calling the Biodiversity campaign, which is our response to, well, we were actually at a TWT, at a trust-wide level, we were behind the actual legislative driver that then set this as national policy now, the 30 by 30 target, 30% of land and sea being managed positively for wildlife by 2030. And the trust's contribution to that we're calling a wilder future. And we want that to be meaningful, and we want to make sure that that message is spread out to all contributors, really. So the team has been working out a set of criteria for how that would be managed. Surrey's nature. This is something else you can pick up on out the front there. There's a few copies of this still knocking about. This was something that was commissioned from the Surrey Nature Partnership and was published in 2017. I wrote this as well with as a collaborative with the members of the Biodiversity Working Group of Surrey Nature Partnership, and essentially we wanted to. We've had a number of the State of Nature and the National State of Nature reports. The most recent one being this one here, the 2023 one that was came out last year in autumn last year. You know, to set what is that national perspective, you know, to actually put it into a county perspective, is very, very interesting, actually, when you start looking at rates of loss and decline and this, when you narrow it down to at a county level. So we intend to do this again, do a second one on a decadal cycle. So I'll be starting to research that in 2026, with probably published in 2027. And having this thing is really proved very, very useful right now. This is target to halt the decline in biodiversity by 2030 via species recovery, because of course we're now entering the era of the local nature recovery strategies as required by the Environment Act 2021. A key requirement from that legislation is for, you know, a legal underpinning to have a blueprint for nature recovery going forward. And Adam Brown is here in our audience today. He's the main project manager for the Surrey Local Nature Recovery Strategy. It's being branded as Surrey Nature Recovery, as that big logo there. And the trust is certainly on the steering group for that. I'm heading up the species element of the nature recovery there, and the state of Surrey's nature has proved a real asset to take us, you know, quite far forward. Other counties are way back in trying to assemble this long list of species that will be then shortlisted as priority species for nature recovery on a county context. So I'm nearly there with my welcome. I just thought just some key names here. It's a small team at the trust, and That's our mission at the bottom. It's a multi-skilled, cross-departmental facilitation team. So we're working to all the other teams at Surrey Wildlife Trust. They come to us, they say, we would like this and answering, we need to know more about this. We do the thinking, the crunching, and we think, well, you could look at this, you could monitor that, you could look at, you find a proxy for that, this, that, you know, that's what we do. We do experimental design, monitoring of progress, what have you. And like I say there, I think it brings the trust instant kudos. Going forward, we're going to be looking to make this event annual if we can. It would be nice to do that. We'll have to see. I mean, it's going very well at the moment. We'll have to see what everybody thinks, but I can see this becoming annual, which would be very nice indeed. We're thinking of trying to find a pot of money somehow within maybe sponsorship, what have you, to be able to offer students that come to us some capital to get some essential equipment, perhaps with their projects. That would be nice to do as well. And then going forward, you know, to turn the team into a consultancy in this area would be great. And that's my working title for what that unit might be called. Kudos. So, like I say, welcome and many thanks for coming, everybody. You'll see me again at the end when I do a little wash up at the end. But let's have our first speaker, Vicky. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thanks a lot for inviting me, and yeah, glad to be here. I think actually, if I remember correctly, I gave a talk to the trust maybe 10 years ago when I just finished my PhD. So some of you might remember me from then. I was talking about brown hairs, or maybe not. But yeah, I'll give you a sort of brief introduction into the work that we do at Conservation Evidence, and hopefully make it a bit sort of clear why, you know, we think that actually both research and evidence are really critical for better decision making in nature conservation. And I'll start by acknowledging that, you know, environmental decisions are really highly complex. A lot of what we do actually involves decisions that are relatively simple. Should we manage this hedgerow in one way or another? But a lot of the other decisions are really quite complicated, and they can relate to anything from, for instance, infrastructure impact and mitigation. And this is something that I'm very interested in, and I'm going to present some examples from the work that I've done in relation to that and how evidence fits within that framework. Threatened species management, what we've just heard about species recovery, international panels, all of this actually, you know, involves environmental decisions. So what goes into informing these decisions, or what should go into informing these decisions? Well, a broad variety of things. Obviously, resources, timescales, and feasibility. You know, there's not a lot of point in talking actually about things that are impossible to really put in practice. Local knowledge and context, including, depending where you work in the world, but including indigenous knowledge, experiential knowledge, and this is something that we're very interested in particular in relation to implementing conservation actions. You know, you might have not published any of it, but you actually have done it, and therefore you have that experiential knowledge. You know what has worked and or what hasn't, particularly actually in relation to your work. Legislation, social, cultural values, obviously all of these actually influence what we do. Economic costs, this is something that I also have a strong interest in. I've co-supervised the PhD student who finished last year, Tom White, and he did amazing work actually in relation to cost in conservation and showing basically how bad we are at really kind of understanding and recording costs in terms of what we do, but also scientific evidence. And as a researcher, that's something that obviously I'm interested in. But, you know, when you look at some of these statistics, actually, and I could bring a whole load of others, the reality is that actually this much talked about research action gap is really wide and continues to be wide. You know, researchers actually ultimately, especially in conservation, do science because they want that science to kind of really directly inform what we do in practice. However, when you look at a broad variety of examples, we see that scientific information really actually mostly represents a very small percentage of the information taken into account. You know, 23% of decision makers use scientific papers at all when compiling nature reserve management. Mind you, that's from 20 years ago, but some of these other ones are actually a lot more recent, including this one. So this was a really good paper by Fabian et al. It specifically looks at forestry management practitioners in Switzerland, and the fact that actually a lot of them, or most of them, really don't use scientific knowledge at all, or in very, very small percentages. And then they were trying to work out why. You know, surely if we produce science, we hope that that science will actually get use and traction. And unsurprisingly, lack of time and lack of access were really kind of critical factors there. But you can see there are also other ones. So language issues, this is something that, you know, people talk about, but actually it's not really resolved. We had a colleague, Tatsuya Amano, he's at University of Queensland now. He does a huge amount of work actually in relation to how big of a barrier this continues to be. Excessive costs, you know, a variety of things. But the point is that evidence is important, and we should really actually look at using it. And I've given you an example here. It's something that we quite often talk about because it's not necessarily the worst example, but it's one that actually is particularly pernicious. And therefore, you know, I have a strong interest in it. So you see, this is an example. Actually, this was reported in the media. Controversial: 175,000 bat bridges over NDR. So this is the Norfolk Road do work, surveys reveal. The problem is that actually they work only in the absence of controls. But when you look at controls, you can see where the bat gantry is. When you compare it with the pre-construction commuting route, most of the bats actually continue to cross the road in the unmitigated section. So it's between, I think, 6 and 11% of the bats that were using these bat gantries. Are you familiar with bat gantries? There's a picture on the next slide. So this is one of these bat gantries. They've been installed actually in a variety of places in the country, from Wales to Norfolk and lots of others. The idea is not stupid. Let me make it that clear. Actually, the idea is that just by in the same way in which bats actually follow linear features such as hedgerows, sorry, not hedgehogs, maybe hedgehogs, hedgerows to sort of move across the landscape. If you actually provide this linear feature above the road, bats will actually fly alongside it, and therefore they'll be at a sort of safety distance from passing traffic, especially actually lorries, which are very high. The problem is it doesn't work, right? And the bigger issue is that actually, despite the fact that evidence did accumulate over time to show it doesn't work, people still implemented it. And this is a big issue, right? It's a big issue because, in effect, actually, if the mitigation doesn't work, roads are actually built, but the problem is not resolved. So bats are still at risk from traffic, but also because this creates a lot of bad press. And this is something that doesn't help anyone, right? The Daily Mail, actually, as you can imagine, had, a day out, went guns blazing, actually, with all these ecology projects, wasting taxpayers' money and all the rest. But as I said, keep in mind that also it erodes public trust. If you have measures that are implemented and then people say, well, it doesn't work, then it actually casts a shadow more broadly. So these things matter. So one way in which actually this could be improved would be, this is a paper from our colleague Lynn Dix, to look at this pyramid, if you want, where you have studies, systematic reviews, summaries, and decision support systems. But really the important element here is that not only do those feed directly into advice, guidance, and decision, then you add experience, this implementation experience that I was talking about. But importantly, this is a closed loop, right? So the idea is that actually decisions then create new studies that actually go and feed into this body of literature, so that we're constantly improving and constantly evolving. And this is what we try to do at Cambridge. This is Bill Sutherland, my boss's project. He has been at it for 20 years almost now. And I think we've done a lot, within that period of time. So the idea with evidence-based practice is, I suppose, in some ways, taking the lessons from medicine and trying to apply that into conservation. But ultimately, what it means is that practitioners make decisions which are informed by systematic and critical analysis of both their own work and the work of the wider sector. And this bit actually about systematic is important because if you actually only use some studies that you might be aware of, you might actually be neglecting a whole bunch of other studies that, for instance, like those bad gantries show that actually it doesn't work. And also that practitioners ideally document their results and contribute to the findings of the evidence base. But evidence, yes, it's there's some really good work actually done by Nick Solovsky in the US, which shows that evidence means a lot of things. It's a very broad term, and ultimately, actually, the available evidence as well as the standards for quality really vary vastly. So that's something actually to take into account. What is, I think, actually very exciting is that conservation evidence is free. And this is something that I'll keep mentioning over and over during my talk. But it's really important that it's free, actually, because it removes one of those, or several, actually, of those important barriers, we hope, in relation to why practitioners are actually not more amenable, I suppose, actually, in terms of interpreting and using scientific evidence in their work. And what it does is it looks at this sort of whole evidence synthesis from a kind of industrial perspective, if you want. You can go and have a look on the website, and it describes the method in great detail. But ultimately, actually, we do these sort of systematic searches of the literature, at sort of vast scale. So we've done something like 1.6 million papers scanned so far, closing now on 9,000 studies that have been summarized. And this is the website interface, and you can put in your words in there. Keep in mind that this is not Google, so don't try to use it actually in the same way in which you would use Google, because that won't work. For instance, we don't have information on threats. We specifically have information on actions. But you could actually type in, let's say, roads, since we're talking about that, and you would get a whole bunch of stuff. Or you could look at the topic. So this is the reptiles synopsis, which was published a couple of years ago. And there it actually shows right from the start how many journals were searched, 293, 8 report series. So that would be gray information. So it's not necessarily actually published information from a scientific literature in a journal, but a report as well, as long as that report is available. And yeah, 700 studies actually that were included for this reptile synopsis. So if you were actually to look at roads, here's an action: install barriers and crossing structures along roads and railways. There's a background section which actually explains what this action is trying to do. You have the global map where you can actually see the locations of all those studies. You can actually click on those if you want. And then you have the key messages, which explains in a really highly structured way, how many studies there are in how many countries. You can actually see that those are interlinked, so you can click on those as well. You can do this on your phone as well in the field. And then it actually goes into structuring those results by key messages. So for instance, in relation to survival or behavior or other aspects. And then ultimately, the summaries that I'm talking about, a large and sometimes really tedious scientific paper of, 20-something pages, we basically try and condense it to something like 150 to 200 words. And this is how a summary looks. And we really try and work very hard to make these standardized, so that actually, as you're looking at a variety of studies, they more or less actually look identical. And in fact, you have the same bits of information in the same places. So it really makes it easier actually for the reader to compare between these studies that actually otherwise, if you would read the full study, they might be vastly different. But very importantly, each of them also has a link to the full paper. So if you read the summary and you think, oh, this really sounds like actually the sort of stuff that I'm looking for, go ahead and read the full paper, the full 20-something pages, if that's something actually that you think is directly relevant for you. And you also have a whole range actually of other actions that would be related to this one. And here are some examples. We've done this actually across a whole range of topics, and these are just some of them. And yeah, hopefully we've finished actually now all vertebrates except freshwater fish. And we're working on that, and hopefully soon enough actually we'll also have a whole range of other updates as well. But keep in mind that we also do assessments as part of this. So this was, for instance, the assessment for the terrestrial mammals, which was published, I think, in summer 2022. And you can see the important element here is that not all actions that are implemented are effective or beneficial. A high number of them are, in effect, 28 actions, actually 12% of interventions are directly beneficial. Quite a lot of others are likely to be beneficial. But you can see some are unlikely to be beneficial, and 6 of them, and 1 of them is actually assessed as ineffective or harmful. And going back actually to the whole kind of road ecology example, I thought I'll relate this to some of the work that I've done in my previous job when I was working as head of conservation at Froglife. So you can see here, for instance, actions in relation to amphibians. Here's again the installed culverts and tunnels and as road crossings. And this is something that I was very interested in, partly because when I was at Froglife, this was one of the SSSIs that was managed by the trust, and that I was kind of in charge with, or rather in charge of the people who are working there. And this is a SSSI, an SAC, a Natura 2000. It has all the criteria basically that you can have for conservation, but it also has a major road going through the middle of it. Well, kind of the middle. You can actually see it breaks 2 separate parts of the reserve, and it's probably the single largest population of grey crostinids in Europe. And here are some of the mitigation works that have been done. That red thing is actually a car. So you can tell that those tunnels are really large, despite the fact that they're installed for newts. The reason for that is that because this is going to be dual carriageway, the idea was actually to really make these tunnels very large. And Froglife did the monitoring for that. And I had the PhD student, and we produced a whole series of papers, which I thought were really, really interesting. And hopefully, actually, you'll understand as well what I mean with the fact that, research does matter in decision making. So when we've looked at this, we created this sort of 3-level, if you want, filters. So A, B, and C. So A would be the individual newts that we found at the fences, B, the ones that actually we got at the tunnel entrances, and C, the ones that made it across the tunnels. Yeah, does this make sense? And when you look at the data, you can see that actually these all act, I suppose, as filters. So you have a lot of individual newts at the fences. Far fewer get to the tunnel entrance, and even fewer make it across, which is fine. We wouldn't necessarily expect that all of them would cross. There's also some strange things in that actually. You can see here, so that's gray females, white males. There are hardly any males for whatever bizarre reason. The numbers here are quite high. They're in the hundreds. So we have no idea actually why that would be. And also it's mostly adults rather than juveniles. But the important thing is actually when you look at this from a seasonal perspective, you can see that the vast majority of the movements are in autumn rather than spring or summer. In summer, there's almost none. And these actually occur for both the sort of movements along the fences and in the tunnels themselves. And you might think, well, so what? Well, actually, this makes a fundamental difference to what that mitigation is achieving. Because in effect, the ecological process here is basically dispersal. So these tunnels are used by newts to colonize new areas. Yeah. So that means that in effect, you don't need that many for this project to be successful. But this is fundamentally different from what you would have, for instance, for frogs and toads, if you install a tunnel and then the individuals have to cross the road because they need to breed. And therefore, your target should be very different. And then we've done some follow-up work, and this was very strongly confirmed. This was published in Animal Conservation, also with Katja. And don't worry about the graph, but the important take-home message here is that actually the newts were moving longer distances in autumn compared to spring, much longer distances. And we've done this actually with this really cool fluorescent powder, which is actually also very cheap to use. And the sort of interesting and I suppose exciting stuff now, everyone talks about AI and machine learning. I think in nature conservation, we're not, I guess, fully kind of aware of just how fast things are moving and how exciting this is. We created these new camera traps, and we were recording this insane number of images per day, something like 70,000 images per day, which obviously you would not want actually some poor student, to sort of go through day by day. But all of this actually now can be done with AI, and at an extraordinarily high resolution, to the degree that you could actually identify froglets which are 1 centimeter long. So things are really moving fast. But luckily, as it turns out, using this data actually at another site in Yorkshire, we were able to show that for grey-crested newts, for instance, road mitigation does work, and it's actually quite easy. You can see there the numbers between 2014 and 2017, and you can see the numbers actually of individual newts. We had the site actually with translocation, so we had a really good idea of the numbers. The numbers were increasing year on year. Also something which is interesting, nobody had looked at before, but highly relevant, and this is why I'm saying that research actually can really inform important decisions. Here are the sort of activity patterns between grey-crested newts and smooth newts. So grey-crested newts in black and smooth newts in grey. And these are sort of 24-hour periods, and you can see that actually grey-crested newts are strictly nocturnal. They only go in the tunnels during the night. And you think, well, so what? Well, the big difference is that actually that also means that they're much lesser risk from getting killed on the road by traffic compared to smooth newts, or actually, as it happens, common toads. And I suppose just to finish on this bit, this is the last sort of chapter that Katja worked on. And I think this is a really powerful way, especially when, when we're talking about species recovery and, what connectivity actually should be really doing. This is a really large area. It's 100 square kilometers, so 10 by 10 kilometers in around Bedfordshire. And you can see the big difference between the dark green and the light green is that actually in the light green, the areas where grey-crested newts were, both in terms of terrestrial habitat and utilized ponds, the roads between them actually, we increased slightly the permeability, slightly. And you can see it makes an enormous difference at the landscape scale. So quite a lot actually of the populations, if those roads, the minor roads, these are not dual carriageway, none of them, because those are really hard to mitigate. If these small roads actually have no permeability, a lot of these small populations of grey-crested newts basically have no future. And I think this probably applies to a lot of species. When people say that connectivity matters, I think this is a good example to understand that, focusing actually on improving the quality of the habitat in a really small patch ultimately is doomed to fail if that population actually doesn't have a sort of structure around it. And these are the bits that I was mentioning in relation to costs. This is something that I'm particularly worried about. You speak with anyone from the financial sector or economy, and they say, okay, yes, you have all this data about actions, but how much do they cost? And as it turns out, as conservationists, we're extremely poor at, first of all, I guess, understanding the structure of costs and then reporting them. You can see here, actually, when we looked at something like 8,000 papers from the global literature, about a third of them mentioned costs, but hardly any, actually, between 3% in some categories which state the components of those costs and 2.6% that quantify them. Even more interesting, actually, that percentage, when you look there at the publication rate, doesn't really increase. And ultimately, this makes a big difference, because if I want to implement something, I want to know not how much it costs you to do, but how much it would cost me to do. So if you're saying this project cost me £2 million, well, yes, but maybe actually the land was yours, and also you had the digger, plus half of your staff were actually volunteers. Then it might not cost me 2 million, it might cost me 5 million. And this is actually why those costs are really important, because decision making really actually should be about adding the evidence on effectiveness to the evidence on costs. You might actually be better off implementing actions that are less effective if they're much cheaper, because you can do a lot more of it. I mean, it sounds really obvious, but how are we supposed to know these costs actually if nobody really reports them? And I'm going to finish by basically saying that guidance is something that a lot of people, especially, if you speak with consultants, a lot of it is actually about the guidance. The problem with guidance is that a lot of it actually in the UK, for instance, is really out of date, in some cases by more than 20 years. And that's really problematic. But also when you actually look, so you can see there's a really big gap actually, for instance, in the last 15 years in terms of publishing any kind of new guidance. But also there are other problems. This is a paper that we published with Harriet Downey, my colleague at Cambridge, and where she actually shows that for a lot of the guidance that is produced, it's impossible actually to trace the statements from the evidence. So things are actually mentioned, you should do this, and you think, but why? How do we know this? And as it turns out, some of the numbers are basically kind of expert derived, which is fine, but we should make that clear, right? To say you can actually put that in place, but keep in mind that this is somebody's opinion rather than something, that has been published and that you can check. So anyway, we produced some principles for evidence-based guidance. This is a free and open access paper that I think actually would be really interesting and useful for some of you to read, because basically it's something that any organization can do. We don't want to have the monopoly on this. Surrey Wildlife Trust, for instance, actually could create its own evidence-based guidance. And I'm going to finish by saying, have a look at this book. It's free. So please don't buy it off Amazon. Unless you really, really want to. You can buy it off Amazon, but also you can download it as a free interactive PDF. You can get it versions on Kindle or on your phone or whatever. But this is a book that we published a year and a half ago, and it actually lays out a lot of the sort of principles separated by chapters in relation to evidence-based guidance. So to conclude, why evidence-based decision-making is useful? Well, first of all, it can minimize biases. It can increase transparency. You don't have to trust people because in effect, actually, the evidence is there. You can go and check it yourself. It can reduce wasted resources, doing less of the things that don't work. It can increase effectiveness and ideally cost effectiveness if we get our act together in relation to incorporating those costs. Synopsis and decision support tools aim to present this scientific information in a way that is easily accessible and understandable. But keep in mind that there are now several of these free platforms, and they're there actually for people to use them. And finally, we really can all help by testing and publishing our results. There's huge amount of gaps actually in the scientific literature, including for things that actually conservation organizations do all the time. If something actually works or doesn't work well in the practice that you're doing, really think about how you can actually test that and present the results so that everyone else actually can learn from it rather than us sort of reinventing the wheel. So next steps, we're now working on incorporating AI. We have some really exciting work with AI at CAM, looking at accelerating the evidence synthesis by using these semi-automated processes. And yeah, if you want to collaborate, get in touch and let us know. And yeah, huge thanks to all our funders and collaborators. And thank you for listening.
Have you got any comments about co-pilots, ease of use, biases, things to be aware of when you're using it if you're working in this field?
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. So we kind of frequently get a bit mortified in discussions with people that just say, oh, we're going to use ChatGPT and we're going to train it on this data set. And we think, please don't do that, because there are so many problems. I mean, quite a few of you probably have heard of hallucinations. So ChatGPT actually has this thing, not because it's evil, but because it really wasn't designed for this purpose. It really wasn't designed. This is something to keep in mind very, very constantly. It creates, actually, it hallucinates. It creates fake information, sometimes including fake references, which, we kind of have fun with, but, they can be extraordinarily serious if people suddenly actually put that in the environmental impact assessment. So we're part of actually what we're working on now is we're going to try and create a co-pilot specifically on only using the conservation evidence data. Long story short, it's quite hard. And it relies on entirely kind of different principles. So rather than sort of setting it free into the wild world of the internet, we're actually constraining it to a very specific data set. And we're saying, actually, for everything that you're producing, I want you to list the evidence. But yeah, I'm constantly worried, to be honest, about the fact that, you know, people are using AI in ways that it lends itself to really big errors. No, not directly. We're now thinking about, and we're trying to work with some consultants in terms of trying actually to create a sort of separate part of the data set that would be accessible as part of the planning system in terms of actions that have worked or not. Problem in effect actually is funding. We need funding for this, and consultants, for better or for worse, don't want to pay for it because they are saying, if we pay for it and everyone uses it, then, you know, what does it do for us? Which I kind of understand, to be honest. Basically, they want a competitive advantage, but pretty much everything that we do, we almost always aim to actually keep it open access so that we're not creating additional barriers to use. People have barriers already, you know, we don't want to add further. But yeah, I think it's absolutely doable. And, you know, hopefully in the future, we will find a solution. But yeah, it needs funding.
You talked a lot about the costs of some of these projects and accurately recording that. Do you have a particular methodology for measuring the economic benefit as well? Because it's not just cost, right? And I'm not sure that we do that as effectively as we should or could.
No, yeah, thank you. It's a really good question. And it's we're working with US Fish and Wildlife quite a lot. And one of the really interesting things actually that they were saying was that very often when they actually speak with legislators, keeping in mind that US Fish and Wildlife are basically a state agency, you know, they get their money from the taxpayer rather. People say, the legislators say, but what's the return on investment? You know, if I give you an extra $1 million, what will this give me? You know, not, you know, kind of nice words, but specifically, will it give me more rhinos, for instance? And conservationists bizarrely actually, or I suppose to some degree understandably, are really loath to sort of create that kind of framework. But I think we're doing ourselves a big disservice. I think if we were actually specifically looking at what exactly would we get more in relation to additional funding, I think it actually creates a much stronger case for funding conservation generally. When you're saying, give me an extra $1 million and I will actually give you, you know, 6 extra tigers and 3 more orangutans, sort of.
The actual competition. How do you select and decide which papers you actually do? You filter them at all based on how reliable they seem to be?
Yeah, very good. No. We don't. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot on the website actually to explain the process. Ultimately, for us, what matters is that a paper specifically implements and tests a conservation action, which actually can be a lot of very different things, education, for instance, and then that it measures that in a sort of normally in a quantitative manner. But otherwise, actually, we don't say anything about the quality of the publication. All we do is actually when the results are clearly not matching what the people are saying, which sometimes does happen, we highlight that in a sort of neutral way. But otherwise, we don't make any comments, actually. The big issue, however, is that when you're looking, and I could talk at length about that, is the fact that when you look at the summaries, the first thing that you'll see is actually the study design. And you'll be amazed by how few of the studies that we have in conservation more broadly actually have what you would call a sort of robust study design. Any kind of before-after control impact. Very, very few, including actually, you know, in the sort of developed world, if you want. And that's, I think, a problem. You know, you wouldn't actually expect these sort of standards in medicine. So, you know, why should we actually have these sort of standards in conservation, especially actually because some of these actions really lend themselves well to this kind of back techie, others are hard, but some actually do work well.
To spend the next few minutes telling you about my dissertation project, which, as Vicky says, was part of a Toastmasters in Environmental Sustainability at Birkbeck, and was inspired by a question in one of the Surrey Wildlife Trust research perspectives that Mike mentioned earlier. And as you can see, the title of the project was Can Sustainable Alternative Natural Green Space, or SANG, Contribute to Local Biodiversity?
Sorry, just click there.
Just keep that.
Yeah.
That's it. That's fine. Great. Okay, so why was this an interesting question? Well, changing land use has been the biggest driver of terrestrial biodiversity loss, both globally and in the UK. Actions such as draining wetlands, loss of wildflower meadows and hedgerows, and increasing use of fertilizers and pesticides has led to a loss and fragmentation of habitats and a reduction in the number of diversity of species. In 2010, one of the government's responses to addressing this decline was to review wildlife sites across England, and the resulting report, shown there as Making Space for Nature, recommended that to create a functioning ecological network, England's green spaces needed to be more numerous, bigger, better managed and better connected. But I think that poses a challenge in England. We're a small, densely populated country where about 63% of land is in use for agriculture. This means large wilderness areas can't be the mainstay of reversing our biodiversity decline. Our ecological network has to be made up of multifunctional land, spaces that deliver recreation or food production, for instance, alongside wildlife conservation. And SANG represented a potential example of such dual land functionality. So first of all, what is a SANG? The 2017 Conservation of Habitat and Species regulations protect European wild plants and animals, allowing for the designation of special protection areas, or SPA, to safeguard them. The Thames Basin Heaths SPA, the words are quite difficult to say, is shown in the top map as the blue areas. It spreads across Surrey, Berkshire and Hampshire, and was designated to conserve habitat for rare ground nesting birds. However, this area is also subject to a significant pressure to build new housing, which brings additional residents to the SPA and potentially disrupts the birds. So in 2009, the Thames Basin Heath Partnership was formed to enable the planning authorities in the area to take a strategic approach to limiting the effect of new development on the SPA. The lower green map illustrates how this was done, with the SPA area shown in dark green. Measures are applied to any development which receives planning permission within the zone of influence, which is between the dotted and continuous red lines on the map. And mitigation action takes two forms: a financial levy on developers, which funds managing access to the SPA itself, and provision of SANG to divert new residents away from the SPA by providing an alternative space for recreation. To meet the European habitat regulations, the SANG must be provided in perpetuity. And to make them an effective alternative, they're required to provide a varied semi-natural landscape and free access for people to exercise their dogs, as this was found to be the most common reason why people visited the SPA. My project looked at SANG through a different lens, separate from these mitigation effects. It investigated how sites might support biodiversity in their own right. I used a mixed methods approach. An initial desk survey generated ideas on how SANG might contribute to biodiversity. A survey and follow-up interviews then tested and refined these ideas with practitioners who own and manage SANG. The Thames Basin Heath Partnership website provided a list of SANG and some of these photos which illustrate what the SANG site looks like. Information on the nature of the sites was also gathered from websites of local authority, countryside and parks departments, as well as those of organisations involved in owning and managing the SANG. I also gathered information on management of the SANG sites from the same sources and from management plans that were submitted in support of planning applications. The survey was devised and circulated with the help of the Heath Partnership team. It was sent to members of an existing working group consisting of 40 representatives from organisations that own and manage the SANG. I received 13 responses, which represented at least 27 of the sites, and then follow-up interviews were conducted with 5 of the survey participants. The remaining slides set out what I found. The availability of data was varied, and the numbers in small brackets on the slide show the sample size for each data type. I found 81 SANG, although new ones are continually being added through the planning process. They ranged in size from 1.6 to 110 hectares, as shown on the graph. The orange bars were representing those sites for which I had management plans. They occupy a total of over 1,800 hectares, and just over half of this is in Surrey. The use of the land prior to being designated as a SANG was varied. 38% of sites were agricultural, and there were a variety of other uses shown here on the slide. There was also a variation in the level of public access before designation. Agricultural sites were on private land with limited disturbance from people. Other sites were publicly owned amenity spaces with full public access. Ownership and management of these sites is complex. Local authorities or partnerships which involve them own 59% and manage 71% of the sites. There are multiple different management organisations, including wildlife trusts, companies linked to housing developers, and a university. Many organisations both manage and own the sites, but some, like Surrey Wildlife Trust, just manage them, and others, such as the Land Trust, own land and work with management partners on site. Survey respondents had a mixed view as to how SANG designation might affect biodiversity. 5 said they thought it was site dependent, 6 that it was slightly or very positive, and 2 that it was slightly or very negative. Overall, the data suggested that biodiversity is affected in 2 main ways. Firstly, through the impact SANG have on land use, and secondly, via the way they influence site management. So let's look at land use. Being a SANG secures the land as a green space in perpetuity, thus protecting it from future development or habitat destruction. The bar chart at the top of the slide shows that survey respondents felt this was the biggest positive effect that being a SANG could have. The second mechanism felt to have positive impact was the creation of new habitats. Research shows that an increased variety of habitat types creates more ecological niches and leads to greater species diversity. On previous agricultural sites, the designation as a SANG led to the creation of grasslands, wildflower meadows, scrub, woodland, and hedgerows. Their biodiversity is to some extent dependent on the maturity of these habitats, which wasn't measured in my project, but will increase over time. Habitat size also has an impact on biodiversity, with bigger areas showing greater species diversity and numbers. SANG owners have the potential to influence this by adding new SANG sites adjacent to the existing ones. Improved habitat connectivity was also seen as a positive benefit of the overall SANG network. This is illustrated by the map on the slide. The SANG sites are the green areas, which are distributed across the region and potentially could act as stepping stones for species to move between habitats. 56% of SANG land is located within a biodiversity opportunity area, where they may be particularly effective in improving biodiversity. However, there's limited scope to strategically influence these land use aspects of future SANG. Their size and distribution are a consequence of the amount and location of house building that is agreed by planning authorities, and this is not driven by ecological concerns. And how about the management of the SANG? One interviewee noted that active management of the sites was required to maintain their habitat variety. The upper bar chart shows the range of conservation techniques used by site managers in orange, and those where they felt this resulted in definitely in biodiversity improvement in blue. The most commonly applied techniques were timing tasks to avoid nesting and hibernation, grass mowing regimes, and the retention of deadwood as habitats. Interviewees said that organisations with conservation expertise could improve biodiversity outcomes, as they had the knowledge to schedule activities appropriately and identify sensitive areas to avoid. Survey respondents said that the biggest barriers to biodiversity improvement on sites came from the Sang's purpose as a space for recreation and dog walking, shown in the lower bar chart. Visitors have the same impacts as they would on the spa, including disturbance and soil impaction. This could reduce biodiversity from the baseline before the Sang designation, particularly on the 60% of sites where at least part of the land was designated for its wildlife value. 11 sites had a statutory designation, including one as an SSSI, and these were largely already public open spaces where becoming a Sang would bring even more people to a potentially sensitive site. However, planning authorities are advised not to agree Sang where they would damage existing wildlife, and some interviewees felt that the design and management of the sites could guard against any negative effects. For example, by laying out path routes that avoided sensitive areas and by using ecological discounts to set up refuge zones excluded from the Sang footprint and thus the disturbance. There were also mixed views on funding. One interviewee mentioned that in a time of shrinking local authority budgets, Sang agreements guaranteed money for land management. However, these funds are still limited. Managers have to prioritise tasks that support the required recreation functions of a Sang, such as car park and footpath maintenance. Habitat management can be a very low priority in both written plans and in contractual agreements. Lastly, there are multiple actors and decision makers involved in Sang. I identified 28 different management organisations, 21 owners, 11 local planning authorities spread across 3 counties. This complexity makes it harder to create a long-term, ecologically coherent approach to biodiversity on Sang. And so where does this leave us? My research looked at the direct contribution Sang sites might make to local biodiversity, separate from the mitigation effects they have on the spa. It illustrates the complex interaction of factors that can both positively and negatively impact on Sang biodiversity, particularly through how they affect the land use and site management. The project also has relevance beyond the local area, as Sang are part of the planning policy in East Devon, Dorset and the New Forest. Sang might also be part of delivering policies aimed at improvement in biodiversity. For instance, they could contribute to the commitment in the government's 25-year environment plan to create or restore 500,000 hectares of wildlife-rich habitats outside protected sites. Also, in Surrey, Hampshire and Berkshire, they could form part of the county-wide local nature recovery strategies. And then I'd just like to finish by saying thank you for the help and support that people gave me in the project, including the team at Surrey Wildlife Trust, the Thames Basin Heath Partnership team, and my supervisor at Birkbeck. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Just changed it. Yeah, I was interested. You may have said, and I'm quite honest, but did you speak to Natural England at all the way they felt about it? Because in the early days of Sands, they didn't like to see too much biodiversity on the Sands because they foresaw a future problem if it became too attractive, and then thereby encouraging even the ground nesting birds that they were trying to avoid through having Sang.
No, not directly. I didn't know. It was just the people who were directly involved in
Yeah,
the management. Yeah.
yeah, thank you.
From the Nature Smart Challenge students at UCL. So these students have been doing some modelling for us, looking at the automated monitoring of insect devices at WPH. So we have Pablo Chavez, Harry Javan Tripler, Kenya Zan, and Bohan Lee. So someone's not in. So I will you take it away.
Cool. Thanks, Vicky. Yeah, Chen Yang could make it, but the three of us will walk you through our research. So yeah, in general, we were focusing on monitoring moths on Pirbright ranges, which is an area of lowland heathland, a very large site, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. I'm going to start by walking through some of the context, and then I'll hand over to Pablo and Bohan, who can walk through the kind of meat and bones of our model. So first of all, why is moth monitoring and insect monitoring important at the minute? I guess just to start with some of the context. So we know that moths play a really valuable role in the maintenance of our environment. They are excellent at nutrient recycling, decomposition, pest control, and also things like pollination as well. This paper at the top, recent paper, kind of setting out to try and highlight the undervalued role that moths play in pollination. And this statistic shows that they actually make up about 1 in 3 of all visits to UK flowering plants. So overall, just to say that obviously they play a really valuable role in the maintenance of our environment. I guess the not so good news is that moth abundance and biodiversity is in decline, and obviously this mirrors kind of wider insect and invertebrate trends. What's missing from this statistic, however, is an appreciation of the kind of nuance in the data, which populations in particular are declining fastest, and how are populations changing in particularly rare and specialist habitats. So although we know enough to know that we need to take urgent conservation action, we still need to know a lot more about how these populations are changing. So all of this is just basically speaking to the kind of the growing need and impetus to kind of have much more moth and insect monitoring, particularly programs over a long term. So hopefully this is where kind of our project comes in. We've been working with the trust to try and basically capture the full species of moths present on a very large site in Surrey. Now, this site is an area of lowland heath, which is obviously not a homogeneous landscape. And within this very large site, there's a number of different habitats. Of course, it's a European priority habitat, and it's really important for many of our invertebrates. And just to kind of highlight the range of habitat diversity found on this site, everything from dry woodland to wet grassland, dry heath can be found on this site. So in terms of approaching our research problem of trying to capture the full picture of moth biodiversity, we really wanted to, as best as possible, try and capture the habitat diversity found on this site. Now, of course, this is a challenge in the kind of world of constrained resources, and many monitoring challenges and questions will often face this problem of having very limited resources to try and understand this problem. Now, in our case, the kind of resource that we're talking about specifically is something called an AMI trap or an AMI trap, which is designed by the UK CEH. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the AMI trap now, but essentially it is an autonomous device, so it can stay in the field for long periods of time, unmanned, and it can automatically detect and classify moth species. In this case, the trust had just 4 of these traps to work with. They cost about £5,000 a piece, so very valuable bits of kit. So our challenge was to try and think about
how best can we place these 4 traps across this very large site so that we can try and capture the full picture of moth species present on this site. So yeah, just to reiterate, we're working within these key constraints of limited resources, which is one that faces obviously many different monitoring projects around the world. This is a remote site with very limited access. And our goal was just to produce a sustainable and adaptable mathematical model to determine the optimum location for sensor deployment, which maximizes habitat coverage and therefore hopefully optimizes for species richness as well. Cool. So I'll hand over to Pablo, who's going to walk through the model itself.
Thank you, Harry. Hello, everyone. So our solution comes from a bit of like a interdisciplinary approach. I don't know if anyone here is a bit familiarized with operations research, maybe. It's like a branch of math that tries to bring these mathematical tools and apply them to like real world problems. So in this case, this is kind of like a facility location problem, and it's not as used in ecology, but we find applications in other areas. For example, I don't know, you kind of like want to locate antennas in a city to get as much coverage as possible, or maybe you're planning your healthcare system and you want to locate the facilities so that the accessibility is equal across all areas of the city. Many papers and like exciting things going on in this area. So we try to build like this interdisciplinary solution between an ecologically monitoring problem and operations research. So kind of like going into the model itself, here we have like a bit of like a simplified map of the site. And like an initial idea would be just to think of like a sort of like a grid. So like every like kind of discretize the space into like possible locations. The problem with this is first, the search space is too big. So like it would take ages, even for like a program, it could be like very hard to actually analyze all these locations. And also a lot of these locations could be unfeasible. Like maybe like it's actually impossible to locate a monitor in that part because maybe like it's like vulnerable to deer, or maybe like it's too wet that it cannot be like properly managed. So the idea is to actually work in pair with the experts and get to sort of like a list of candidate locations that are actually possible. In this space, like maybe there could be even more, but like a reduced space of locations that are actually possible to locate them in. And then the task of the model is actually deciding which of these locations are the best. So let's say we want to locate KME traps out of these n candidate positions, and we want to sort of maximize how much we cover of each habitat. So kind of like formalizing this model, this part is not as important, but kind of to understand that like every part of like what we're saying in words and ends up being like a sort of like mathematical element. So we have this set of parameters. These are fixed things. We just give them to the model. So like the number of monitors we have, how much area in each location is being covered. Or for example, we can think of like prioritizing a certain habitat. And then we have variables. These are things that are like as optimizers, we can actually tweak and get different results. So in this case, it's like, where do we actually locate the monitors and how much area in the end are we covering? So then like a bit more math, the fun part, but just like formalizing everything you say into words into an actual mathematical constraint. So for example, I want to say that I only have K locations where I can actually put monitors. Well, put that into a mathematical constraint, and then the model in your computer will do the rest. And finally, the like maybe most important part is deciding what you're actually optimizing. So in this case, we chose this particular one that is like maximizing the minimum habitat cover to sort of set like a lower bound for all the other habitats. But this could be different things. There's different functions that you can think of trying to balance, like each habitat has like a decent representation of what you want to cover. So now the actual, a bit more fun part, we built a little bit of like an app to see how this works in practice. This is locally in my laptop, but we don't have it here. So it's a video that I hope it works. So let's see. So here you can kind of see that we have the map, and I hope it's possible to see, and there's like a list of parameters. So you can see how changing the different parameters displays the optimum solution in the map. And you can maybe play with the number of monitors you have and also the range of these monitors. And you can see that both things actually influence the optimal solution. So maybe if you assume that the range is bigger, the actual optimal solution is different. And this is something that an expert can do by hand and maybe get to a decent solution, but out of like all the possible combinations, it's really hard that you can actually get to the optimum. So that's like the value on this app. Like you can visualize and play around to see like, oh, if I get an extra trap, how would the solution change? Maybe like when I have 4 and then I have 3, maybe like which one do I have to remove? Things like that. So then finally, this is like a way to like easily visualize this, even if like the person using it doesn't necessarily have a background in optimization. And then, is it slideshow here? Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, and that's basically our model. And then, sorry. Yeah, how do I go to the next slide? Oh, here. Yeah, you got it. Oh no. There you go. Okay. Yeah, so that's basically our model, but of course, this is not absent of risk. So Bohan is going to talk you a bit through them.
Thanks, Pablo, for bringing us this beautiful model. However, our research encountered certain challenges as well. And I will talk about 2 main risks for this research and their potential solutions for them. The first risk is the model is too complex. So too many parameters would mean that the model isn't adaptable to other monitoring scenarios. For instance, like there are too many parameters in one model will make this model too complex, and we took more time to calculate something, and it can alienate our stakeholders, which means complex model cannot be easily understood or used by non-experts, and we could lose some potential investments. Therefore, we have 2 mitigations for that. Firstly, we trying to use suitable parameters. As Pavlo has mentioned before in his model, we selected 5 imperative parameters to generalize our model to keep it simple and effective. Secondly, we're trying to keep our GIS data simple. So GIS data is one useful tool that widely applied in ecological study. Simple GIS data can make our model more general and adaptable to different scenarios while keep our model effective, which boosting the reliability of our model. The second risk is inaccessible monitoring locations. As you can see from the map, the red block is a fire range of the military. So it's not safe for our trap setup. We should avoid that. And this entire reserve is inaccessible due to military use and the wetland topographies inside this whole area. Some wetlands could reach the depths of individual's neck, which could be very dangerous for our researchers. We should also avoid that. Therefore, we trying to ask help from local experts, like local lodgement. Firstly, we cooperate with experts from Surrey Wildlife Trust. They can provide us some useful information about local moth habits and the vegetation types. Also, we asked help from our land manager, Ben. He knows this land well, that he can give us some suggestion about potential candidate site selection, which not only saves our time, but also improves the model's reliability.
Yeah, so just to wrap up, so obviously we know that through moth monitoring, there's really key declines in many invertebrate species, but we really lack an understanding of the nuance here, and particularly rare and specialist species that occupy environments like Pirbright ranges. So using these very powerful pieces of technology like the AmbiTrap can lead to better results, but obviously we're going to be faced with these resource constraints. So hopefully a model like ours can serve to help ecologists and applied conservationists make more effective decisions in order to understand their kind of research goal. But yeah, thank you for listening.
Yeah, so I think there's many like similar problems, but you can have like especially with this like new expensive technology, that this idea of like constrained resources supply. So of course there's a bit of tweaking in each particular area, like getting the GIS data, actually studying like with the experts, but like the general framework can be applied to different monitoring programs.
Yeah, that was why we really wanted to start from a position of local knowledge. You know, the same could be said for Indigenous knowledge overseas. Start from that point and then use that to generate a list of candidate locations. And then from there, that's when you can start to bring in the maths and the stats to, yeah, really optimize.
New species per GB or new species per area? Are they all programmed well, or are you, how do you cope with that problem? I think that you said 80% of insects are undescribed.
Yeah.
Worldwide probably it is, but how about your target species in locality, and how do you know it?
So just to clarify, I think the technology you're talking about is the AMI trap. We didn't design this. I wish we did, but this was the UK CEH. Now it's trained on a data set of you know, existing moth species. It uses onboard artificial intelligence in order to do this classification. Yeah, it would be mainly UK data. I'm not sure how effective it would be outside of a UK context, but yeah, I'm definitely not an expert on the AMI trap, unfortunately. But yeah, I think information would be available online.
Over what period of time does the AMI trap need to be in operation for you to collect the data for a particular area?
That hasn't necessarily been defined. I think working with so this research question, correct me if I'm wrong, Vicky, but Ben's goal was to try and capture the full species across the whole site. So we were thinking about one future iteration of the model could be thinking about how you could rotate the locations of the deployment. So, you know, 4 times a year, maybe that would be ambitious based on how much access is allowed on the site. But I think some period of rotation would be required in order to kind of fully cover the entire site.
Yeah, that was kind of behind my question, given the cost of the equipment.
Yeah.
You know, how many organisations, sites could actually reasonably have access to it?
So I'm going to weigh in. I know this is sort of the precursor to your project. So it works essentially like a Moth trap. So you put it on overnight and you get data the next day. The number of times that you like retrieve the data from the local storage is how often you can actually check that. In terms of the accessibility for different groups, this is actually deployed on I don't know how many the numbers right now, but definitely hundreds of sites globally. There's predominantly farmlands in the UK, but they also have kind of everywhere. So I definitely encourage you to look on the CEH website for that, for like more of the technical information about how this is running. Yeah.
I think they've recently just launched a mini version of this device as well. So I think, you know, we're starting to see the cost come down already. So hopefully it's not long until these are fairly widespread.
You mentioned adaptable monitoring techniques. So what would you need to do to be able to translate the model that you've written from like the AMI traps into something like camera traps on a site?
Yeah, so I think first is like really understanding how, I don't know, like the range or like, because in this case, like it's kind of like arbitrary, which is like, I don't know, like a 50-meter range, but like depending on the particular technology, it's just like looking at like what the literature says about like the coverage and like maybe even the like geometry of how it's being measured. And then like from then it's kind of the same idea always, like you assume there's like a range of area that it covers and and then the model is kind of always sort of the same. So maybe like range and also like the candidate locations and the GIS data. Yeah.
We'll do, yeah, 1 minute.
Regarding the model, I assume that to maximize the number of habitats, these ambi-traps would generally be like proposed to be like in the boundaries between the two.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, considering the obvious simplification of the geography, and also perhaps slightly different like habitats in the borders of like in between two separate habitats. So is it actually like, did you account for that in your research? Like, is it a separate habitat like as in a border, or can an ambi-trap actually cover two separate habitats at once?
So I think obviously this to come back to the range of this device. I think to properly understand that, the UKCEH doesn't have an estimate of the range of these devices. Like obviously that depends on the distance that the moths will travel, and their susceptibility to the light, because they put out quite a powerful light that then draws the moths in. But I think it is fair to kind of assume, you know, maybe 100 meters. Similar studies that have looked at the effect of light on species or potentially like street lights, they've used around 100 meters as that range, and then made their decisions based on that. But yeah, I think more research is needed in order to like hone in on what that range.
Yeah,
that range is.
Coming into that also, like, it's a good point. Like, you have like multiple habitats, even like the most species coming in, and you don't really know where it's coming from. So like kind of like a second iteration we're thinking of, but like this is not fully developed. But it's like thinking of how like you can like get a probabilistic approach from like every time a species come, kind of like there's a probability that it came from like whatever like the area of that specific habitat is being covered, and then use that to like generalize the data. And then like you could also think maybe it's better to just put it in one habitat and you're super sure. So it's kind of like a trade-off of like covering more habitats, but a bit of uncertainty, or like being super deterministic and putting like each ambi-trap in a specific habitat, but probably you're gonna lose because this has like 8 different habitats. So with 4 ambi-traps, you still like need to get to this trade-off of like one ambi-trap covering more than one. So like that's kind of the idea.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, Rosa is not available today, but we are lucky enough that our supervisor, Dr Sarah Papworth, is going to present her research for us. So Sarah's presenting on cultural and demographic differences in their effects on the data of the Surrey Wildlife.
Yes. Extra luckily for me, Rosa had also already prepared her slides. So I'm presenting Rosa's MSc investigation, which is looking into volunteers for Surrey Wildlife Trust. Before I ask, can I see a quick show of hands of who has donated their time to conservation in some way, perhaps as a volunteer? Let's see, that's pretty much everyone, I would say. So this is about you, basically. This presentation is about conservation volunteers. Oh, and why is that so interesting? Well, actually 27,000 weeks of volunteering work is contributed per year to the 10 biggest UK environmental NGOs. That is a huge amount of work. And that, of course, leads to a huge boost in the amount of conservation that can be done by those organisations. So a real key question is, why do people volunteer for conservation? And as a lot of you are volunteers for conservation or have been in the past, you've probably got a good idea of what volunteers you, but from the perspective of an organisation, knowing why people come and volunteer, or why they might want to but haven't yet, or why they might not, can help encourage more volunteers, which would then help hopefully mean that even more work can be done. So Rosa looked at conservation volunteers using the COMBI framework. So this is just one framework for looking at behaviour and how we can explain why people do certain behaviours, in this case, volunteering for conservation. So it's a fairly simple model. It's got 3 different aspects, of which one is motivation. That's the M, you can see it there. But there's also capability. So that might be, for example, your perception of how able you are to do the particular work. If it's practical conservation volunteering, you might not think that you've got enough physical strength to do some of those things. And then the opportunity. So, for example, are those opportunities available to you in your local area that would allow you to do that work if you wanted to? So the idea behind this model is that all of these 3 things come together to determine whether or not an individual is actually going to do the behaviour of volunteering. And so Rosa focused on Surrey Wildlife Trust's practical conservation days. She chose them because of all the wonderful work that they're doing here in Surrey. There's 70 nature sites that Surrey Wildlife Trust are managing. They've got more than 4,000 registered volunteers working across more than 6,000 hectares, and they run multiple different sessions every weekday. So Rosa could go to those sessions, talk to current volunteers and find out why they do it. So this is a picture of Rosa here, having a little tea break on one of these practical conservation days. She went to 3 in total in spring last year, and there's a picture of Rosa, or part of Rosa anyway, on one of those days. So 3 different sites, speaking to the volunteers that were present there. Just really quick 5-minute conversations during those tea break, and she managed to talk to 24 of the volunteers at those 3 sessions with 2 principal questions. What is it that motivates you to volunteer, and what is meaningful to you about it? So this is just some initial trends, because what Rosa did after that was she followed up with a survey to try and capture a broader spectrum of the volunteers at Surrey Wildlife Trust. So the people that she met on these practical volunteer days, they were mostly older, they were mostly male, mostly retired, and they enjoyed being outdoors and keeping fit. And she used this information to create an online survey, which I'll also explain before talking to you about the results altogether as one part. So the online survey was shared in Surrey Wildlife Trust's newsletter. She had 49 responses, which is really great to get that many people responding, but it's not really enough to look at major trends. So what Rosa was really initially interested in was looking at demographic differences between different groups, younger and older volunteers, but she just didn't get enough people responding to her survey and enough diversity of people attending the volunteer days to be able to look into that. But what she did do with the survey was to split people up into current volunteers. But because the survey still goes out to people, anyone registered on that mailing list, they might not be current volunteers, they might have actually stopped volunteering. So she still wanted to hear from them, and she designed the survey to split people into these 4 different groups, so she could find out from ex-volunteers why they stopped volunteering, and from aspiring volunteers why they hadn't started volunteering yet, but they were clearly interested because they're on this mailing list. So she split the respondents up, and she also asked them about possible interventions. So these are things that could perhaps be changed about the volunteering days to try and remove perceived or actual barriers for people who want to volunteer but haven't actually done it yet. So on to the results. There is an awful lot happening on this slide. So it is split up. We've got behaviour down at the bottom, conservation volunteering, split up into the opportunity, motivation and capability. The number of people who mentioned a particular thing in the interviews are shown in curvy brackets, and people mentioning it in the survey are in square brackets. So you can see that some things were mentioned by a lot of people. So a lot of people mentioned the love of the outdoors. That's the top, oh no, left, top left. Never get it right on the spot. Top left-hand side. More than half of the people in both of those 2 samples talked about the love of the outdoors being a motivation for volunteering. And then if you look down in this side, got capability, poor health. People who were in the survey mentioned poor health as a reason why they didn't continue volunteering, for example. And an opportunity retirement gave people the time that they needed to actually be able to spend their time volunteering for conservation. So there is a lot happening in here. There's a lot that Rosa found in there. This is just a one-slide summary of all the different things that people said in that survey. And then the other thing she asked about is intervention. So she asked whether there were things that Surrey Wildlife Trust could change that would make either them or people they knew more likely to take part. The things that Rosa thought of herself as a result of those initial interviews are shown in white up here, and then they're ordered by the number of people who agreed with those interventions being useful in the survey. And then the blue interventions are things that people suggested in the survey. There was a kind of a other box. What else do you think might help? So, for example, including information about how physically strenuous a session would be was said to be quite important to 17 out of those 49 people. And sessions targeted to new volunteers was another thing that was particularly mentioned by people who aspired to volunteer. They wanted to, but hadn't started yet. And that partly links back to one of the reasons why current volunteers said that they continued volunteering. And that is that they initially came to help nature. They initially came because they wanted to get out in the outdoors. But what actually kept them volunteering was the sense of social environment, the camaraderie they felt with their fellow volunteers. You know, people in the interviews mentioned how the tea break actually became one of the most important things to them because they got to sit down, people brought cakes and they shared them. So that kind of camaraderie is brilliant once you're in it, but if you're new and coming into that, it can be a little bit daunting. So those new volunteers suggested having sessions that were targeted at those newcomers. And then there's a lot of other things here. I'm not going to read through all of them because you are all capable of reading yourselves, hopefully. But if you do have any questions about these specifically, then please do ask me about them, or you can ask Rosa about them. Very happy. She'll be very, very happy to talk about them because she's very disappointed she's not actually here today. Just a little bit of evaluation in terms of what Rosa initially set out to look at, which was those demographic differences, interested in why younger people volunteer, how you can get people from different demographic groups, and she just couldn't actually talk to those people to find out their perspectives. So we are hoping to try and expand this out and send the survey out to a much broader range of volunteers at different wildlife trusts to hopefully capture more of those younger volunteers from different socioeconomic and racial backgrounds as well, to find out what would encourage them to volunteer as well, to get a more comprehensive view of what could encourage more volunteering. Rosa's personal reflection was that the COMBI model of looking at this question worked really well. It was a really interesting and straightforward way to sort all of this diverse information she was getting from the different volunteers. And she also found from looking at the literature that actually a lot of the kind of academic literature looking at volunteers focuses, like she did initially, at current volunteers and asks them why they've come and volunteered. There's much less attention on people who've stopped volunteering and people who want to but haven't yet. And in particular, looking at the people who've stopped volunteering, that could be a real key area to understand why people don't continue coming, why they just come once or twice perhaps, or why, you know, even after years they might stop coming. So yeah, it was really, I think this was a great project. Rosa really enjoyed it. But our final key messages. So the main reasons that people mentioned why they volunteered were a love of outdoors, the social interaction I mentioned, helping nature, and also exercise. So emphasising these benefits of volunteering could help encourage more people to get involved, but also removing some of the barriers to volunteers could help as well. So, for example, sharing accessibility information, such as how physically straining the session might be, how much walking might have to be done on site, how people can actually get there on public access, and whether there are bathrooms nearby as well. Because if you're going to a nature reserve, if you've ever been to a nature reserve, they're not well known for their bathroom facilities. But having that information might encourage more people to come for these sort of 4 to 6 hour, potentially could be a whole day session. Another thing that people volunteer for was to try and develop their skills. So Rosa suggested that cross advertising with the education and skill building work that the Wildlife Trust does as well could help increase volunteering, and then also having tailored sessions, so for those newcomers, or possibly shorter sessions for those with less time. There we go. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions.
Individuals, because it doesn't exist. It's nonsense. Clearly, it's not something anyone wishes to mention. Interestingly, it was in your online survey at a lower level.
Yeah.
So that, yeah, as I say, it's the difficulties with the actual participants that who are willing to talk about the why they're actually out there.
Yeah, well, and to the volunteers that are sort of subscribed as well, they're volunteering across a whole wide range, not just the practical conservation, you know, on the site. There's also people volunteering for the education team, all kinds of other things. So that it is a slightly different group, but yes, but it's really interesting the things that came up in those different groups that Rosa wouldn't have captured if she just used a survey or just gone to talk to people on site as well.
Yes, I was wondering if Rosa had any insight or hypothesis on as to why there was such a disparity in gender towards males.
We talked about it. It didn't sort of make it into the final thesis. I think historically, perhaps volunteering was even more male dominated. So she talked to the female volunteers there on the day, and they said, oh, one of them said, oh, I was the first, but then once I joined, then a few more joined, and now there's sort of a few of us, but still male dominated. But as to why, yeah, sorry, I'm sure Rosa would have an answer.
On the bathroom facilities.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
In graduates and say to them, look, this good work experience included volunteering within that. You'd have the motivation immediately.
Yes, I mean, we do. Surrey Wildlife Trust does do that, I believe. And yeah, maybe Vicky's better to.
So sent the list of volunteering opportunities that we have at Surrey Wildlife Trust. Yeah, yes. Working with those.
It's very difficult though to get, even doing that. So we were a small nature reserve, which is heavily male dominated, with 5 males. We have 1 or 2 females, right? But we've tried to engage, like Maurice Wood, for example, they have a course in practical habitat management for 16 to 18-year-olds, where they have to do 150 hours of work experience. Can we get anything from the site? No. So I think the barrier then is just transport, because they're young adults, they're not older. But it's really difficult to get young people engaged on the reserves for whatever reason. Yes. We find the DD groups, yeah, we had DD groups come, which is great, and we can have more. So trying to push it through, some of the volunteer social sections of the DD program, trying to get people to come to do that. But again, it tends to be midweek, so it's in school time. So you can offer weekend maybe. I don't know. I mean, it's really difficult to get. We've done some good stuff with Bill Ice Feature, especially like to work to the utilise, which you think is my work, it's going on next.
I'd like all the conversations you've got to break in a second. I'm just aware of us overrunning, but thank you so much, Sarah. And I'm going to talk from opening. It's going to be going over our internship with us results. That was comparing our management practices with conservation evidence.
So hi everyone, my name is Ugne, and last summer I did internship at Surrey Wildlife Trust, and my job there was to look at the reserve management plans and at their specific actions and see whether they correspond to current conservation evidence. So firstly, why is this important? So generally, a lot of management is done based on experience and much less based on evidence that's scientifically based. So this internship was an opportunity for me to evaluate how well Surrey Wildlife Trust actually uses currently available evidence to base their management actions. And to do that, I use conservation evidence website that's been already discussed today. Yeah, you can see there are a lot of categories, as already explained by the first speaker, I believe. And yeah, I was able to use this website to see where the management in Surrey Wildlife Trust corresponds. So the first finding I had was that a lot of actions I could not actually find on the website. So that was quite a big issue. You can see that over here in the access, recreation, and interpretation related actions, 83% of them could not be found on the website, which was quite interesting to me. And also all habitats, which was a category that covered usually the whole of the reserve, also was kind of difficult to find matches for. On the other hand, for the rest of habitats that are more specific, there was only between 40 and 20% of unmatched actions. And yeah, this should be kept in mind going forward, because the rest of the results show the actions that actually match the evidence, and they will be looked at through two perspectives. So firstly, I will discuss them by habitat, and then secondly, I will discuss them by the reserve. Yes, so this graph shows the percentage of each evidence actions in different habitat types. And you can see that access, recreation, and interpretation, those were actions that have to do with, for example, education, information boards, public access to the reserves. So from the evidence actions, there was 96% that had beneficial outcomes. And you can see here what each category corresponds to. So beneficial outcomes were the actions that had some evidence for positive outcome. Yes, and then going forward, all habitats also had quite a majority of the actions indicating beneficial outcome. However, these two categories, as we just seen previously, were the ones that had the least actions actually matching any evidence. So this was quite few actions. For the rest of the habitats, there was quite a variation. You can see there's still a lot of uncertain outcome indicating actions, which is quite problematic because apparently a lot of there's not enough research being done to really figure out whether the actions that conservation professionals are doing are, beneficial or harmful. So I think it was quite interesting for me to see a student who looks deep into environmental issues, what's going on in the field. Yeah, there were 3 habitats in particular that had quite a few of trade-off outcomes. Those were wetlands, grasslands, and woodlands. You can see they have around a quarter of their actions in trade-off areas. So that means that the actions might be beneficial and maybe harmful in other ways at the same time. Yes, and then so this is a big graph representing all the reserves that I looked into. There were 31 in total, and again, there's quite a big variation in the outcome of the actions that are taken in these reserves. So actually, an interesting finding I did was that the management plans with the least actions in total, so that means they're probably smaller and therefore there are less habitats and there are less actions taken. They had the most extreme values. So for example, the Sheepley's Reserve right here in the middle, it had the most positive outcome indicating actions, 83%, I believe. Meanwhile, for example, these two in the corner here had non-positive outcome indicating actions, and all of them actually were uncertain. There wasn't enough evidence to really know whether they're beneficial or harmful. So yeah, there's actually a lot going on, but overall, this table here below shows that on average, 43% of the actions taken in the Surrey Wildlife Trust reserves are beneficial, and the same percentage, 43, have uncertain outcome. So overall, 86% actually have either beneficial or unclear outcome, which means that we really need more research to know whether these actions are good for the environment that Surrey Wildlife Trust manages. And then 14% were trade-off outcomes. So it would be very important to actually look into where these are exactly done and whether they achieve the objectives of that particular reserve. Because yeah, that means that in some ways they're beneficial, but in some they could be actually potentially damaging. Yes, and then there was less than 1% of harmful outcomes, and that was actually just one action that that was quite complex in what it was trying to do, and only a part of that action matched an outcome and an action that had negative outcomes. So it indicates a harmful outcome, but it's actually unclear, because if we would if we would account for the whole of the action, we would potentially find that it may be beneficial, but I couldn't find any more evidence to actually know whether that specific action could in other ways be beneficial. So yeah, overall, it was a really interesting experience for me to take on and to see what conservation looks in practice. I found it's quite difficult to actually match the actions on the reserve management plans to the conservation evidence website, and that's because Surrey Wildlife Trust has way more detailed actions that they do in each reserve, and meanwhile the conservation evidence website is quite broad, and they often don't specify, for example, a type of grassland, while Surrey Wildlife Trust does that, and they actually have a lot of categories for different grasslands, woodlands, and other types of habitats. So there were quite some challenges. So of course, some simplifications had to be made, but overall, I found that Surrey Wildlife Trust is doing quite well. There were barely any negative outcomes of the actions that they do, which is great. And overall, there simply needs to be more research done to really know what's good, in focus. As we saw, around 43% of actions in each reserve had unclear outcomes. Yeah, so thanks so much.
Can you be a bit more specific about the actions of access, restoration, and something else that
Yeah.
Not, yeah, recreation interpretation that were not matched.
Yeah, so that means I just couldn't find any action that would actually do the same what the ones in the reserve management plans do. So those were often just specific specific access that, for example, public has to the reserve, like using particular paths, or for example, putting information boards. There was often I couldn't find anything corresponding to that.
Increasing access, increasing recreation.
Yeah.
Facilitating interpretation.
Exactly. A lot of it was also like guided tours. I think there was quite a few that were like that, but there simply isn't. It's not covered on the website, so I couldn't really decide.
We'll do one further question because we're a bit running over right now. So.
Sorry. Super interesting. Very, very briefly. Interpretation, recreation, and access would not necessarily be covered by conservation evidence because it doesn't actually match with the conservation output. Although it might be certain further down the line, if you see what I mean. But otherwise, actually, it wouldn't be included. Certainly, access would not be included.
Yeah.
But I'm just, really interesting. One thing actually that very quickly I would like to say is that interpretation usually is not undertaken actually in any kind of scientific design generally. And I think there's a really missed opportunity there. Everyone does education and interpretation, but we almost never actually work out whether does that actually help in any way. And that's something that we could actually look at. And SUS, for instance, do quite a lot of work in relation to interpretation. Why are we not doing this with reserve management?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, I think there were a few that were on the website actually. Well, 17%. But yeah, definitely a lot is uncovered. And also they usually just very specific on the management plan. So then, it's kind of hard to actually find a match because the website is more general and broad. Yeah.
We'll have an opportunity to approach Ugne during the break as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Siggery. I also work in the research and monitoring team at the Wildlife Trust. You see me running around making the PowerPoint work. But I just want to say thank you so much for listening to all of our student talks this morning. It started really as like kind of a passion project of mine and Mike's a lot of years ago. It's really grown into something fantastic. And I think the interdisciplinary nature of conservation research has really been highlighted by the breadth of presentations this morning. We've seen maths, which is way over my head, social science research from Sarah, policy, management plans, all sorts of great stuff. So please give another big round of applause to our students and enjoy tea and coffee for the next 15 minutes, and then we'll be back in here afterwards. Thanks, Vicky. So obviously it's a bit of nepotism why I'm here talking first, but that's okay. As I mentioned earlier, I work at the Wildlife Trust in our research and monitoring department, and I have been around the Wildlife Trust for about 7 years now, doing various different things. But as of the last year and a half, I've also been a PhD student at the University of Surrey. The University of Surrey has a really fantastic program called Practitioner Doctorates, where you work and do your PhD, both full-time, which is a lot of work, but it's really good because it means your research is very applied inherently, and what you do is directly relevant to the organization that you're based in. And it's a really broad scheme. There's people like me doing paleoecology stuff. There's people doing hydrogen pipes and scope 3 emissions and the labels that you put on, food boxes to say their carbon content. There's literally everything under the umbrella of sustainability. So it's a great scheme. Anyway, I will actually talk now about what I'm supposed to be talking about, which is my PhD. So what's really fantastic is that we had a great talk earlier about conservation evidence, and we've heard lots throughout the morning about how not enough research is being done to fully understand the ways in which we can do better nature conservation. We know, again, as we've heard a lot about this morning, that nature is not doing so great at the moment. The WWF cited this 69% global decline in wildlife populations. We're all probably familiar with the idea of the Anthropocene, with the idea that humans are the overriding force influencing Earth systems these days. And there's this big gap as Silvio and others talked about, between the research being done and the dissemination of that into the hands of the people it's supposed to be useful for on the ground. That's a two-way problem. There's some things that academics could do better. There's some things practitioners can do better. And it's complicated by huge variety of different factors. But both sides recognize that it is a problem and working on solutions. A study done internally at the Wildlife Trusts found that only 13% of wildlife trusts felt that they were actually doing evidence-led conservation, but 86% of them said they felt it was really important to be doing that. So there's a big difference there in terms of what we think is important, what we should be doing, and what we're actually able to do in practice. So there's a space then for lots of new research and new mechanisms to try and help us cross this bridge or gap, as it were, from what's happening in research to what's happening in practice. So there's tons of things that you could think about to try and bridge that gap. But the one that I work on in my PhD is the idea of using paleoecology to better inform conservation work. So for those of you who aren't familiar, paleoecology is basically just the study of past ecosystems and how they've changed over time. It uses fossils, whether those are kind of larger things like seeds or leaf remains, whether they're smaller things like the fossils of algae or other small crustaceans. Those things can tell us and paint a picture about what an environment used to be like, and tell us through the same ecological processes that we understand today, what the environment was doing and how it's changed over time. That's been, a qualitative thing in terms of a descriptive thing about what an environment might be like in the past. But the science has also developed ways to make it more quantitative as well, and use mathematical models to help, for example, calculate exact pH values of a lake in the past from the fossil assemblages that can be found in the mud at the bottom of it. So it's a really interesting science. And it has become more and more applied in the last few decades, but there's still a big gap again in terms of what people think it could be used for and why it would be so useful if we could better harness it, and the amount that it is actually being used. So a recent study, again, a couple of years ago, felt that 38% of people working in the field felt that actually it was truly applied as it currently stands. So certainly quite a fair bit less than half. And there have been some highlights. It's had some real bright spots in terms of its integration with things like the Water Framework Directive, but generally there is this big disconnect. But there shouldn't be, because it is a really useful concept when we're looking at conservation questions, restoration of ecosystems. It has the USP, unique selling point, of being able to tell us really empirically about long-term ecological processes. If we are lucky in kind of modern conservation monitoring, we might have a data set that goes back 20 years, but you're really not going to get many long-term data sets that go back 50, 100, several hundred, thousands of years. They just don't exist in terms of modern monitoring. I mean, for example, thermometers were only invented in 1850, so we're not going to have temperature records prior to that. So anyway, ecosystems happen over long periods of time as well. When we think about things like soil formation, forest growth, those are really long-term processes. They happen in decades, they happen over centuries. So we can't fully understand how those processes work based on a data set for only 10 years. The variety of conservation questions that paleoecology could help us answer is very broad. We could use it to think about reference conditions. What should an ecosystem be like? What should we aim for when we're restoring it? What is the true natural state of that ecosystem before there was too much human intervention? Where have we lost species? Where have they declined? Where have they gone extinct? What are the reasons that maybe the reintroductions of those species aren't being as successful as they could be? How did we manage ecosystems in the past? And was that better than the way we manage them today? And also just how things vary over time. What's a natural range of variability for an ecosystem? And what's a non-natural range? So the questions you can answer are really endless. And I don't have time to talk about that. I probably don't have time to talk about what I'm supposed to already. I've been rattling on. But what I'm going to talk about is a case study of Chobham Common, which is National Nature Reserve in Surrey. It's a site that the Wildlife Trust are lucky to manage on behalf of the County Council, and it has a whole host of important legal designations. It's a National Nature Reserve. It's a site of site of special scientific interest. It's a special protected area. It's a special area of conservation. The list goes on. So it's very, very highly designated. It's a real highlight of the lowland heathlands in the south of England. So it's an internationally important patch of our lowland heathlands. Has an interesting history of military use since the 1850s, particularly during World War I. And the modern landscape of Chobham Common is something that's very threatened by wildfires. I'm sure many of you who've followed the Trust closely or just interested in nature in the local area have seen the sort of horrible images, really, of the devastation caused by wildfires in the last, well, every year, basically, in recent memory. There was one on Chobham Common, I think, in 2020, that was the really, really big one there. So we're battling with what do we do about all these increasing wildfires? We're worried about scrub encroachment on the site, as always. And the management of heathlands at the moment is a very topical issue. So it's a great place for, you know, my research to situate itself and say, is this something that paleoecology can help us with? So last May, we went out onto Chobham Common and we took some sediment cores from a couple of the ponds that have existed for longer periods of time on the site. So you can see me there with the big Pringles tube that gets pushed down into the mud at the bottom of the lake, and then through hydraulic pressure, it kind of, you bung the top and you lift it up and you get a big column of sediment going down. And basically, based on the kind of idea that the younger stuff is at the top, the older stuff is at the bottom, you can then work down the core and see the changes ecologically that happen. And that section is a cross section of what it looked like. It was very weird green clay color, that one, but don't know about that. So yeah, we took the cores and we chopped them up into 1 centimeter slices to take back to the lab and examine there. So I'm going to talk briefly about the different things we looked at in the actual sediment and then what they told us about Chobham Common. So the first thing we looked at are these things called SCPs, or spheroidal carbonaceous particles. They're basically a type of ash that only exists through anthropogenic fossil fuel combustion. So these things did not exist on Earth before we started burning fossil fuels. So because of that, they are a really good indicator of where you know, fossil fuel energy production started in your kind of patch. So in the UK, that's around the 1850s when we have the Industrial Revolution. So although you can date cores with things like isotopes and radiometric dating, people often hear of radiocarbon dating, you can do it a bit more crudely and with a kind of more estimated dating approach by looking at the concentrations of these things. Where they first appear, you can say, well, that's the Industrial Revolution. And then you see a really big increase in them around 1950 post-World War II, when we suddenly start burning loads more fossil fuels. So in terms of what we found in the 2 cores from Chobham Common, you can see the one in the middle, the one labeled B Garden Pond, has that typical profile that I was just talking about. If you go from the bottom from 40 centimeters down to 30 centimeters, there's none there. So you can assume quite comfortably that that's pre-Industrial Revolution. You've then got between 30 and 18, where there's a kind of very low level occurrence, but they are there. So that you can assume then that's between 1850 to 1950. And then you have post 18 centimeters and upwards, it really accelerates and you get a big peak around 1970, 1980, where we start getting a bit more clean air legislation in, and then you will see a drop off in the concentration of these things in mud. So although it's not as precise as something like radiocarbon dating, it does give us a good sense of the chronology of the core. The other one there is one of the other cores we took, and just as an example of what can happen with this kind of work is that the profile does not behave as it should. You know, you go down to 0 and then it starts to get bigger again afterwards. And what we interpreted that as was potentially this pond had been dredged, maybe someone had put a lining in, the sediment record had been jumbled up somehow. So probably that was a bit of a dud core and not one to do much more work on. So the second thing we looked at was the remains of charcoal. Quite intuitively, you can assume that if there is lots of charcoal in your sediment, it's evidence of big fire events. So the more charcoal there is, the more frequent and intense the wildfire events will be. You can count it manually by looking for little pieces of black charcoal under the microscope. And there are also clever ways these days you can do it where they do kind of image analysis with AI machine learning techniques to count them for you so you don't have to. In terms of what we saw at Chobham Common, the green lines there are based on the kind of rough dates that I talked about from the other slide. And what we see is a huge increase in macro charcoal remains sort of just before 1950, and then certainly after 1960 through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s. And that largely aligns with what we would assume to be true about the site, that we know that wildfire events have got a lot more intense recently. But what you can see from this is actually that increasing intensity has been happening really since the 50s. It's not something that's just started happening in the last few years. There's also a kind of interesting bit right at the bottom where we see higher levels of charcoal remains in that kind of pre-industrial revolution era. I haven't quite ascertained why or what that's a result of, but it is quite interesting. I definitely want to look into it further. Third thing we looked at are things called diatoms, which are a type of microscopic algae. They have these really intricate and beautiful glass-like fossils that they leave behind because their kind of cases that they live in are made of silica and it preserves very well. These things are very, very diverse. There's millions and millions of species of them, and they're all very, very fussy in where they like to live. So a species can tell you quite precisely about what conditions would have been present at the time. And these are the things that you can use to start putting into mathematical models and quantitatively reconstructing things about pH or temperature, salinity, nutrient levels, all sorts of things like that. So the results that we came up with at Chobham, the graphs that paleo data is presented on are not the easiest to read. They definitely need some improvement in terms of science communication, I think, generally. But what really you're looking at is that at the bottom, there's a lot of this stuff called Pinularia. And as you move up, there's a lot of this stuff called Eunotia and a couple different species of them. And basically, the fluctuation between these two groups of species is what gives us quite a strong signal about changing pH across the site. And then the reconstructive pH, like I mentioned, through those mathematical models, we see a kind of gradual decrease from about 5.3 all the way down to sort of 4.8, 4.7. So we're seeing the site get quite acid as we go through time. And then towards the top of the core, it starts becoming less acidic and goes back more towards a neutral state, but still very acidic. So we can probably assume that that is hopefully a result of, again, increased legislation around emissions controls. A lot of work was done in the kind of 70s and 80s based on paleo work, actually, about kind of evidencing that freshwater acidification was a result of fossil fuel burning. And then obviously we've cleaned up our act a bit after that. So hopefully the recovery of the acidity at Chobham is a result of that as well. There's also something interesting that I want to explore further, where we know that wildfire events can increase the alkalinity of a site kind of immediately after the fires. So it may be actually that the wildfires are the things pushing it back away from being more acidic. And is that something we need to worry about, perhaps, in terms of it pushing it too far outside of its natural acidity range? Finally, the last thing we looked at were something called macrofossils, which are basically larger remains that you can see a bit more easily with the naked eye. Things like seeds of aquatic plants, you might get leaves of or seeds of plants neighboring the pond falling into it. These are really good to tell you more about the real local dynamics of a site rather than a kind of bigger picture look, because as you can imagine, usually larger things don't travel as far from their point of origin. But obviously seeds, things like birch seeds, can travel a fair distance as well. So it can tell you about the site quite broadly. So in terms of the results from those things, again, these diagrams are not the funnest things to read in the world, but there's a real big shift from this kind of stuff, which are sedges, wetland grasses, pond weeds, as well as aquatic invertebrates like caddisflies. You can even find the cases of those. There's a lot of proper wetland aquatic stuff in this middle section. And then as you move towards the top of the core, you can see all of that stuff starts to fall away and you get a big increase in birch trees, which is this stuff over here, the Betula remains. So we see that probably the site is drying out because we're losing a lot of our wetland vegetation, and it's becoming more vegetated by things like birch, which we know can be a risk in terms of wildfire. So when you put all that together, you can start to unravel the story of what's happened at Chobham over the last 100, 200 years. And I've tried as best I could to put this all on one graph in a non-confusing way, but it probably isn't. So essentially, the key takeaways for the story are that we've seen a big increase in wildfires on the site. We know that that is probably going to continue because of climate change. And we can link that to other indicators that we're seeing. We can see the loss of the wetland plants, as I mentioned, as a drying out of the site. And obviously, as a site dries, it becomes more vulnerable to burning. We can see the increase in birch represented by the kind of orangey blob here as a kind of representation of the increased fuel load that now might be on the common for when those wildfires occur. And it also tells us a bit about the scrub encroachment that the Wildlife Trusts are trying to perhaps prevent through grazing. Obviously, the birch is still massively higher than it was back in the 1950s, for example. And that kind of opens us up to a new set of questions that are worth pursuing about the SSSI prescriptions of the site. What habitat targets are we managing based on the EU Habitats Directive? Are they the right ones? What are those changes in acidity a response to? And this work, it definitely isn't finished yet. It's the kind of beginning of, we've got the story in front of us, and now we need to kind of interpret that story and use it to really apply it to those conservation management questions. And just like we were talking about earlier, with the role of conservation evidence and research being done, it needs to actually have an application at the end of it. So it's all very well and good us producing graphs like this and saying, yes, there were lots of Carex canescens hanging around in the 1950s, but it's more about, what does that tell us about Chobham? How can we use that information to help our management of the site? So in terms of what's next for me, we've taken another core at Thursley Common, so another area of really important lowland heathland in Surrey, and we'll be doing kind of similar analyses on that, linked in with the Natural England Heathland Connections project. So there's more work to come, and we're going to be seeing if, you know, for example, these trends in wildfires, are they present across other heathlands as well, or is it a Chobham problem? Are there parts of maybe Chobham's military history that have had more of an influence on it than other sites? So thank you for listening, and apologies, Vicky, for probably running over. But hopefully that's given you a bit of a taste about what paleoecology is and why it might be important and could be really important and useful for answering conservation challenges. Thank you.
Agricultural practice, like a managed learning in that environment?
Yeah, it could be a result of potential management practices at the site. It's a bit tricky because, as I mentioned, this core hasn't been dated in a way that is beyond kind of those key estimations. So it's hard for us to know how much sediment, for example, has accumulated between 30 centimeters, where we can say, okay, that's roughly 1850, and 40 centimeters, where we see that increase in the charcoal again. So it would be really interesting to get it dated properly, because then you would be able to say, oh, that increase is in the 1600s. And then, you know, you could look at what management practices were done in the 1600s. Does that correlate with that? Is that a signal of that? But that's one of the limitations with doing it this way. But it's an interesting point, and sorry to go on, Vicky, but part of what puts people off paleoecology is that it's perceived as very expensive, very expertise heavy, very time consuming, and there are ways of doing it in a kind of less expensive way. So one of the things I do want to explore in my research as well is whether doing things like this are cheaper, less time intensive than doing you know, the proper radiometric dating on a core. It's probably cheaper, but it probably takes more time. So there might be trade-offs there as well. And as Silvio mentioned as well, cost is something that's poorly generally understood in conservation, but it's something that has a very big impact in what we think and what we're able to do in terms of our management.
Much for inviting me today. I will talk you through an amazing project, Space for Nature. where we use citizen science data and Earth observation satellite data and other geospatial data as well. So as Vicky said, I work at the University of Surrey. For half of my time, I am a lecturer. Actually, one of my students is here in the room. And for the other half of my time, I work for this amazing project. So thankfully, we obtained from People's Postcode Lottery 1.25 million grant, which enable us to create this open access tool to map key habitats in Surrey County at the moment, as there is an urgent need to restore and reconnect habitats in this county, but not only. So we work closely with Surrey Wildlife Trust, Bug Life, and Pencil Park. So how Space for Nature started? Well, back in 2020, I think, yeah, 2020, I did a secondment for DEFRA during my PhD, and one of the main aim of that test and trial actually was at that time for the new environmental land management policy, was to look into the Earth observation satellite data potential to look into how we can support the new policy. So we explore different ways of satellite data to look into the habitat segmentation, habitat connectivity as well. And as you can see here, there is an example, so I have to show. So on the up, there is an habitat assessment of the dormouse, and the red dot is the dormouse record from 2019, I think it was that one. Alex, can you stand by the mic to the recording? Oh, yes. Okay, yes. Okay, I didn't know. Okay, yes. Oh, yeah. Okay. Much easier. Okay, that's great. So as you can see, this red dot here is the dormouse population, and through a visual interpretation of the satellite data at very high resolution, we can look at how the habitat of this population is connected or disconnected. And then we have explored some of the machine learning, like supervised classification, where we managed to map some of the land cover. I wouldn't say habitat, because all of this classification are actually a land cover type and not a habitat. So what is missing, particularly in this map, is the ground truth data. Mainly because it was COVID, but I wasn't able to go on the ground to do some of the quadrats and plant identification on that. And therefore, we have some of these land cover type, which are not always useful for the ecologist. Yes, we can quantify easily through how much grassland we have or scrub, or we can look at the canopy shades, and actually this shades it's actually useful to understand the small blue butterflies, but it doesn't give us that level, particularly level 4 of the UK hub. So, well, we were already well connected with Surrey Wildlife Trust at that time. So we were thinking that it could be a really powerful tool if we merge, if we combine. Sorry, I'm just. I need to mistake here. If we combine citizen science data with Earth observation data. So we have Space for Nature now, where, as I said, we use very high resolution satellite imagery, citizen science data to support the nature recovery in Surrey. And as you can see, one of the main aim is to create a highly detailed coverage of the distribution and connectivity fragmentation of the key habitats. So far, we have collected last year quadrats and plant identification on heathlands and chalk grassland. And as you can see here in these 4 images, maps, we have one of the preliminary results of chalk grassland prediction.
We have a satellite image at 3 meters spatial resolution. And then here we have other products of the land cover, which are open access, available for everyone, which are based on Sentinel-2, is a satellite at 10-meter resolution. And you can see the difference, and our results provide, in other words, a more fine granular habitat prediction of what we have in mind. Ultimately, we want and we hope to achieve to look into the habitat quality is not only to predict where are the chalk grassland or heathland, but also to look into the habitat quality. But this is more challenging. Probably we don't have time now to go through that. So there are 4 main steps for predicting key habitats in this project. First is the data collection. So where we have collected mainly very high resolution at 3 meters from PlanetScope, citizen science data, and other geospatial and Earth observation products, and also expert knowledge. So we rely on this, and we believe that is very important. In terms of data processing, we went through different processing tools to prepare the data for the machine learning, because in the next step, we have used supervised classification, where I will explain you in a bit more about, and random forest. These are the 2 main approaches we have embraced. However, we are planning to use other as well. And the results, of course, is at the moment we have obtained prediction of the chalk grassland and heathland. So a few words about how the data has been collected, about citizen scientist data. Daniel is probably in the room, and Vicky as well, to, yes, good, in case I missed something. So they created an amazing app, a bespoke app, where they have been used by the trained volunteers. And as you can see in this image, they put here, different indicator species images that will help citizen scientists to select the right, plant on the 1 square meter quadrat. But not only about the indicator species, but also non-target species, as well as taking information about the habitat condition. So last year, they managed to engage with 130 volunteers, and I can't even imagine the amount of work they have done to do this, but also amazing job by the citizen scientists to collect 360 quadrat points for both chalk grassland and heathland habitats. Please correct me if I'm wrong about the numbers. So, as I said, Space for Nature doesn't come, as I explained earlier, it's not enough satellite data. We still need this, the ground truth data. So this slide, I will show you actually some of the Earth observation products we have used. So the PlanetScope at 3 meter resolution and 4 spectral bands, so the red, blue, green, and near infrared, which allow us to look at the vegetation health. Digital terrain model from DEFRA. This is open access data as well at 2 meter resolution, and we managed to derive different topographic parameters like the slope of the hill or the aspect, and many other topographic parameters. We also use soil texture. These were from Cranfield University. Soilscape is more information about the soil. And then we also derive some vegetation indices from the satellite data, like the NDVI, the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, which actually gives us the information about the vegetation health or the presence of the vegetation. and how actually machine learning is working. And I will go very quickly through this, and I hope I will make it very clear. So random forest is basically based on the training data sets. So the training data sets, the presence of the chalk grassland, I will take chalk grassland as an example. For the training data set, we used citizen data, and for the absence, we have selected a random point across Surrey County where we avoided the chalk grassland and especially grassland in general. Variables, the environmental variables I have just shown you in previous slides, but what random forest does is basically stitching from all these presence and absence points on the surface on the county, and it's learning from all of these environmental variables and try to predict other areas with similar characteristics. Supervised classification, which you have on the other side, it's using basically only citizen science data and the spectral reflectance of the satellite data. And it's learning basically only from the spectral reflectance. And some of the results very briefly. So this is based on the supervised classification, and what you can see here in this boundary, black boundary, it's actually the quadrats in query hangars. And through the supervised classification, we managed to predict other areas, not only in query hangars, but also across the county. So in this image, you basically, we also obtained from Surrey Wildlife Trust some of the visited sites, over many years, where actually they know that there is chalk grassland. So this is just an example to show that our prediction of the chalk grassland, which you can see in red, are within these polygons, within the visited sites. And more precisely, 90 out of 120 visited sites, we managed, our model predicted chalk grassland. So in terms of the heathland, and this is actually also based on the supervised classification, we managed to predict heathland pretty accurately across Surrey. And actually this one I want to show you more, because this is more based on random forest regression, where we have used citizen science data, of course, and the 8 variables which I mentioned earlier. And you can see in purple all those heathland predicted across Surrey. In terms of the accuracy assessment, because in machine learning, you need to do some of the accuracy assessment to look at how well performed or not well performed is your model. We obtain a very good accuracy, where 1 is very accurate and lower number would be the opposite. But we don't want to stop here. We want to go on the ground to verify some of this prediction to give us a different level of precision of our results. So in terms of Space for Nature for communication, research communication, visibility, engagement, network, well, this is one of the examples in this event, but Surrey Wildlife Trust engaged in many other events, doing a great job. But one thing I want to mention is that Space for Nature is obtained this accreditation from Space Climate Observatory, which is an international initiative launched in 2019. Is basically to combat and to adapt to the impacts of climate change using satellite data. And through this accreditation, we obtain a place at COP28, as you can see in this sphere, let's call it. where among 42 other UK projects were featured at this very important conference where people from different countries, but also policymakers, were able to learn from our work. So in terms of the next steps, well, I hope you all can join our stand and presentation at Nature Tech, which is organized by Knowledge Exchange Platform. But also what we try to do, as I said, we try to bring more transparency in our validation processes. And therefore, we want to conduct some of the visits to check our prediction, basically. At the moment, there is a new campaign of new data collection, as I understood, and that information will help us to make other prediction on other type of grassland. Yeah, that's all from me. If you have any questions, please do ask. Thank you.
Did that lead to any changes in the way the model was constructed on the basis of that?
Okay, so machine learning models which I have used has learned from the quadrats and the information collected by the citizen scientist. So without that information, I couldn't be able to make the prediction. That's how machine learning works, basically. Exactly, yeah, because probably I forgot that all of the data collected by citizen scientists is geo-referenced. It means that it has a location on the map. Yeah, and that helped me, help the model to learn from all of those environmental variables and predict other areas with similar characteristics, like that location of from quarry hangars or from other sites from where the data has been collected. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, of course, I will be staying afterwards. Yeah, thank you.
From University of Surrey, talking about the nature collection number.
It's one of the few times when people actually pronounce my surname correctly. I often tell them that it's juice and tea, like the two drinks, because people pronounce in every sort of way. How are you doing with energy? Are we good? Yes, yes. The last 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, yes. So my name is Matteo Giusti. I think you can read that too. I'm a researcher at the University of Surrey, and I'm a researcher in sustainability science. I try to understand how to make this animal, try to conserve and preserve this animal, which is human over long periods of time. That's what sustainable development is, really. And I don't necessarily address the crisis of the biodiversity or the climate crisis. I try to go at the causes of those crises. I consider the climate change or the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis to be symptoms of something that is an unsustainable form of development, an unsustainable form of progress. And I'm trying to get at the assumptions of that progress, at the assumptions of that form of development. And one of the main assumptions is that we just ignore the fact that whenever we degrade the environment over long periods of time, we tend to degrade the very environment that provides all the services that we need: water, air, food. And this disconnection is at the very foundation of this unsustainable form of development. And that's what I'm trying to address. I'm trying to understand how people can, learn, love nature enough to protect it, and how they develop a relationship with nature. Now I'll give you a bit of academic insights, just a tiny bit. This is just a systematic literature review, which means we have scanned everything that's been written since 2010 about human-nature connection. in academia. And what we have seen is that there are three chunks of knowledge, three different kinds of way in which scientists have approached human-nature connection. They study that as an attribute of the mind, an affinity, a sensitivity, awareness, environmental concern, etc., or as an experience, as a nature experience. Being in nature, what does that mean? What does it imply for your well-being, etc.? Or as place, so an attachment to a very specific geographical area, sense of place, place attachment that ultimately allows you to protect that environment, allows you to be interested in that space. I think that for the last 10 years, my work has been trying to kind of unify these three bodies of knowledge. Because when we ask what nature means to people, this is another study that I've done on children, you see that, yes, nature is plants, animals, but it's also peace, it's also people, it's also pollution, it's also love, it's also danger, it's emotions. It's not just space. It's not just the environment. And funny, it's in the same, it's similar to the concept of home. Home is not a house. Home is not the wall. Home is family. Home is living. Home is peace, is love, is freedom, is food. Funny enough, when we ask them what's the meaning of city, well, at least the participants of my study have been saying predominantly that the city is just shopping and fumes and activities. Isn't the streets, it's not the park, it's not the cars around, it's just this activity. And when we put these meanings to understand the desire that these children develop to work for nature, then all of a sudden we see there are psychological factors here. I just took away the methods I've used because they don't mean anything to you. But these are psychological factors, psychological attributes that contribute to a connection with nature. But we'd also see that there is a social context that is very important. How much the idea of home overlap with the idea of nature is very important for their connection with nature. And differently, how much their concept of home overlap with the concept of city and themselves, how much they see themselves overlap with city contributes to a form of disconnection that negatively affect the desire to work for nature. So we're definitely building cities that do not contribute to nature conservation, or at least that doesn't contribute to the development of the desire to preserve and conserve the environment. And this is visible in society. We separate the human habitat from the natural habitat. There's a clear distinction. That clear distinction is reiterated, is maintained, and creates this psychological separation in our own minds. We assume that we are separated from nature because we don't have the possibility to experience it. We don't have the ability and the possibility in urban environments mostly to create that connection, to experience nature, to experience the ecological processes that ultimately they allow us to survive as a species on this planet. So how do we, this was the problem they had. We need to link, again, this mind space and mind space and experiences. So after I've done a systematic analysis of the literature in academia, I wanted to understand how professionals see human-nature connection. What is human-nature connection for people like, well, you, who have been working in this field for a very long time. So I interviewed people, I interviewed professionals in this field, and I tried to synthesize their knowledge. And I sent out a survey that went out to, well, I received answers from 200 different organizations across 22 countries. And based on the answers to these questions, I created a framework. I created a framework that I tried to validate, well, across a variety of countries. And we try to understand how do natural spaces support human-nature connection in forest preschools. What's the role of trees? Trees are essential. Trees are essential because they provide shade, they're objects of study and they're subjects of study. They provide the branches for creativity. They provide a lot of what is needed to forest preschools. We use the same framework to understand how rural integration can be integrated in the community. We use the same framework to understand how nature-based experts can promote human-nature connection in South Africa. And what we have now is kind of a better answer to those questions. So I integrated the scientific knowledge and the practical knowledge, and I tried to get an answer to these questions. So what is a human-nature connection? And oftentimes in academia, the answer would be a psychological attribute of the mind, but it's not, it's a relationship. It's a relationship like a relationship you have with another person that you develop over time, over experiences with certain specific spaces or with certain specific other living beings. It's a relationship that takes time. It's a relationship that grows from your ability to be in a natural environment to your ability to interact with that natural environment, and then ultimately to the desire to protect, to contribute with your own action for the well-being and the health of the ecosystem of the animals. And within this framework, there are several different milestones that you can achieve. Obviously, if you're not comfortable in a natural environment, you wouldn't be able to be a steward for that space. You wouldn't care. You wouldn't like it. If you're not able to be in a natural environment, if you're not able to go to a forest because you feel comfortable, because you're scared, you won't be able to act to preserve it. It won't be voluntary. Well, I mean, unless you are a white man, 50 years old, you would probably have other attributes. So this is part of the framework that we are creating. What is a connecting experience? A connected experience, from what we've seen, is characterized by quantity and quality. Yes, repeating the same nature experience, repeating the same nature activities in the same way that you repeat the same encounters with a person allows you to develop this connection. But it's also the quality of an experience that matters. You know, maybe playing football with somebody will allow you, playing sports will allow you to become friends with somebody. But in order to develop love for that person, you require a different kind of experience, a different kind of activity. And out of this synthesis, out of this, I'd say, transdisciplinary work that we have done, I came up with 16 of these qualities that can be useful when you design nature activities or when you want to monitor your nature activities. Now I'm going to list them here, and I'm going to take them away immediately because they're way too long for you to read them all. And I will give you more information about it later. But fun is one of these attributes. And if you had to evaluate this experience, you can see that it's fun. You can see that it involves physical activity, that there is a sensory immersion, and some degree of personal autonomy. But if you had to evaluate this experience and how that contributes to your connection or your relationship with nature, then all of a sudden it involves different attributes. And these attributes are meaningful to create that connection. Now, I'm going to stop here. I think this is the essence of the Be Nature framework that we're trying to propose. Now, together with the Surrey Wildlife Trust, together with Kirsty and Pam, there we go, and Luis, we are developing a guide that uses this framework, a guide and toolkit that allows you to use this framework to evaluate your nature experiences, to monitor them, to design better design better nature-based activities. And ultimately, we hope it will be a foundation for an entire curriculum that allow you and other people to progress in their journey of connection with nature. We will use this to gather data for research, but we will ultimately use this to promote nature-based education. And I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Generally speaking, we focus on how we attract people to come to nature through reserves or whatever.
Yeah.
What you're saying, should we be reversing that? Try and take nature to those people that don't get out of that sort of experience. So can we develop within cities, towns, whatever, areas that would attract people and hopefully generate that interest that would then lead them to get out into the natural environment or the non-city environment?
There are a variety. I don't think one should exclude the other,
no.
First of all. I think that working to create synergies between what are called nature-based solutions and nature-based education is definitely a very good strategy to go and promote human-nature connection in urban areas where nature is actually lacking. So I would not be an advocate of land sparing. I wouldn't be an advocate of like, oh yeah, let's preserve nature here. We don't touch it. We don't see it. It doesn't exist. I would be much more an advocate of land sharing, where we do have, especially in urban environments, where man-made environments are reutilized, or where nature is being integrated in these man-made environments, and that there is a possibility to create a connection where most people live, because ultimately that's that nature-rich routine that you have on an everyday basis is ultimately what gives you the possibility to create a relationship. It takes time and it takes repetition. It takes reoccurring nature experiences and reoccurring nature activities to create a relationship. In the same way that, you know, it would take time and reoccurring experiences to create a relationship with another person. If you sit once a year, well, maybe, hopefully, it's an old friend, but it's probably insufficient to create that depth of connection. Yeah.
So the very final part of our afternoon is a short look at what we do with universities beyond research, because we've heard a lot today about nature connection and volunteering and the importance of the younger generation getting involved with nature as well. So just to finish off, we have two very short talks from Ruby from Royal Holloway and Lucy Smith, who is from Surrey Wildlife Trust, just to talk about some of the work young people are doing to be better connected with nature, and also the kind of wider remit of what we do in our work with universities and stuff. So I'll hand over to Ruby.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Ben was saying, my name is Ruby Tomlinson, and I am the president of the Biological Society here at Royal Holloway. I have now been in my role for a year, and I'm very lucky because I'm continuing next year. But more particularly, I've been especially lucky to work with Surrey Wildlife Trust and with the department to help bring wild recorders to Royal Holloway. And so what we've been doing is monthly events organised by Surrey Wildlife Trust, the department, and with the Biological Sciences Society, focusing on different taxa every month. So we started with our very first one on mammal trapping and tree identification, and that was truly a blast. Like, it started at 7 a.m. and we had a fantastic turnout, and it was just wonderful. And each of these sessions, they really focus on the theory and knowledge of each of the taxa, and then you get to go out into the field and you get to experience it firsthand. So we had mammal traps that were laid by Vicky and Becky Thomas, one of the senior lecturers here in ecology. And, you know, we had presentations, and you can see in this picture, these are nuts on the table, because we had from Surrey Dormouse Society, we had Catherine come in to talk about dormice and looked at the identification of their bite marks on seeds. And so you get both the theoretical knowledge and the understanding of it, as well as the hands-on learning. And this was one of ours on trees. There's Izzy from the Surrey Botanical Society, who was absolutely fantastic. And we got to learn all about identifying trees based on their buds, their bark texture, the marquescent leaves, and it was really so fabulous. We got to go around campus in January. It was cold, it was rainy, it was early in the morning, but there was such a great turnout and everyone really, really loved it. And it was awesome to get such a hands-on knowledge that you don't get in many other things. And that's one of the really great things about Royal Holloway as well, is that there are so many opportunities like this. And so from each of the events, there really is an application of the content, and it fits in very nicely with the subjects and studies that we learn at Royal Holloway. So this was from the bee event, and so students got to go out on campus looking for bees, examining the different species. And then this was one where it was more lab-based, looking at the chemical properties of lichens and identifying them based on, you know, chemical reactions. And personally, it's been a fantastic experience for me to get to network, but I know for each of the students, they also have that incredible connection now with all these professionals in the field who have come to each of these events, and having that connection from these networking events to foster new communications, and to have, well, hey, I was at this event with you, do you remember me? And then you can start a new conversation from that. And having these opportunities to connect with professionals is really helpful, especially for biology, ecology, zoology, to get those connections in the field, because it's really difficult to, you know, find your way. And so I really think that it has been a fantastic opportunity for all students. And personally, I really love the mammal trapping because I'm a big fan of mammals. But from a very like motherly sort of role, it was very nice to see the excitement from all the students, because really the first session, like I was saying, was at 7 a.m. and it was cold. I was walking to campus at about 6:30. It was dark, and I showed up and I'm like, oh, I wonder who's going to come. And we had a completely full house. It was so wonderful. Everyone was so connected with what we were doing. And so this is Becky Thomas, one of our lecturers, and she was helping with the mammal traps. And that was just such great fun, and everyone was so invigorated in it, and it was just really, really phenomenal. We do have our final one coming up this Sunday, so if any of you are here, that would be lovely to see you there. We're doing it on butterflies and dragonflies, so there's presentations on both, and then you get split into the two separate recording groups, one of which is the butterfly group walking an official transect, so it will go to their data collection. And then the other will be dragonfly group looking around campus for dragonflies, and that's going to be wonderful, especially because of the good weather. So not necessarily today, it's been a bit bad weather today, but otherwise hopefully it'll be sunny. And this was just one of the photos that we took at the tree event, and that was just really, really so wonderful. You can see everyone's quite bundled up, but everyone was so excited. So I just want to say, first off, special thanks to Vicky, because she's really been super influential in organising this, but also Becky Thomas, our lecturer, who isn't with us today, but also Dan, I don't know where he is, but is that Dan as well, and then also all of the session leaders who really helped bring this all together, and also my team at Biostock, because they're really influential too, and obviously all of the guests as well who come by and support this. So thank you.
And we will now seamlessly transition to Lucy, who is going to tell us all about the Youth Action Committee at Surrey Wildlife Trust.
Hi everyone, I'm Lucy. I'm a General Officer with the Youth Action Committee at Surrey Wildlife Trust. And as Ben said, I'm just here to let you know that we exist, basically. So we are a group of 15 young people, age range from about 16 to 30, and we are all committed to getting young people opportunities to network with people in green sector jobs and just get people engaged with nature in general. So we were established in March 2023. I myself joined in November last year, and we are made up, we have our co-chairs, Ness and Josie in the top right corner, top left up there. We also have Ash, a communications officer. We have Ed, a fundraising officer, and we have Jaron, who's not on here, who is an events coordinator, and the rest of us are all general officers. So we attend regular meetings to give our inputs on what we as individuals would like to see out there in Surrey in terms of events to get us skills to go into green sector jobs and networking events. So we meet formally every month and we discuss how we can engage and empower young people to take action for nature. So getting people to go home and into their local communities and actually influence and inspire others themselves to take an active role in conservation. So whilst we're having these meetings, we've discussed our aims. So we aim to create a community of young people. So we're a hub where people can network and form friendships, but we also aim to promote opportunities for young people in the local area. Now that we're more established and we have more of a secure budget, we're hoping to arrange more events personally, but so far we have supported various Surrey Wildlife Trust events for young people. So one of those would be the Youth Action for Nature conference that took place in April just gone, where we had a big group of young people join us for the day to attend talks given by other people just emerging into green careers. So for example, I gave a talk about the Surrey Wildlife Trust traineeship, which I'm currently on. We had a talk from a master's student from Royal Holloway, and we also had a guest speaker from the collections department at the Natural History Museum. We also, on that day, we held sessions on pond dipping, so pond invertebrate ID. We had Dan Banks, licensed bird ringer, lead a bird ringing session with us, which was very exciting. And we also led sessions on how people can engage their local communities in terms of activism, so writing to local MPs, or how people can go home and create wildlife ponds. So we did a bit of everything on that day. We also had an event yesterday aimed to engage young people, run by our communications team and Billy up at the top there, to basically teach young people how to use their social media platforms to educate people about wildlife and certain species, and to promote them to do things, especially with the 30 Days Wild coming up in June. But we don't only promote just Surrey Wildlife Trust events, we also promote other events held by recording groups, for example, and we advertise these in a monthly e-newsletter, where we also have monthly blogs that members of the Youth Action Committee write ourselves. We also have book recommendations, TV recommendations, wildlife photography that we've produced ourselves. So it's basically a really good place to learn what young people 16 to 30 in Surrey are interested in from a wildlife standpoint, and to find out about various events going on where you can network with people in green sectors or gain skills from certain sessions. If you are anybody can sign up to our newsletter. If you are interested, we do have a web page on the Surrey Wildlife Trust website. If you yourselves or you know somebody, so members are 16 to 30, if you know somebody in that age category who would like to be actively involved in the work of the Youth Action Committee, as I mentioned, we're hoping now with our budget to actually host events ourselves and really link up with some other organisations to get some professionals to come and give talks and ID sessions. If you want to get involved with that, you can join the Youth Action Committee on our Surrey Wildlife Trust website page as well. So that's just a little bit about us. Thank you for listening.
No further ado. Yes. Wow. What a range of activity and wonderful collaborative opportunities we've been looking at. I mean, it's stunning actually, and as much to do with nature engagement. So, you know, in the second session as well. Yeah, no, very, very impressive indeed. So I'll just say a couple of impressions about, you know, I've only got 5 minutes, but yeah, conservation evidence. I mean, it's just reiterate the fact that we are champions. We've signed up, the trust has signed up the conservation evidence champions, which just shows you how much commitment we have to being better evidenced in what we do, what we seek to do, and, you know, and that capturing of what we do as well, because that's the thing, you know, you start doing things in good faith, on the hearsay as being the best practice, but, you know, actually, do you ever record it and justify it? So yes, we are conservation evidence champions. On the SANGs, yeah, well, you know, that just goes to show from that, I mean, it reiterated to me how much the SANG, you know, a lot of data is collected on people visiting, on the footfall into SANGs, but it's not a lot of it gets crunched with any good conclusions on how effective they are. So, you know, the work there is really essential for feeding back into the effectivity, and then, you know, making SANGs be further opportunities for nature engagement. In fact, what else did I? Yes. Well, Ugne's work. Yeah. Well, I've already said it. You know, so much she found out that so much stuff just doesn't get captured and fed back into you know, to be able to evidence that stuff is working, just doesn't get recorded. But this is what we're on this journey to change through being conservation evidence champions. Ben, yeah. Well, Ben is a legend in his own right, but yeah, it just goes to show, you know, with the ecological piece, it's very easy we always jump to these conclusions that species are locally extinct because of anthropogenic, you know, reasons, and we just make that but often it's not. It's entirely natural process, and getting a better take on that is really important. Space for nature, I think, yeah, I mean, perhaps what we didn't come across with there is that what's really important, because you know, you think, well, yeah, chalk grassland, we know all the chalk grassland is, we know what a heathland is, why do we need it? But the thing is, one of the biggest problems in these large data sets on habitat, you know, extent and distribution is that you get these huge gaps where they're inaccessible because landowners won't let you on their land, you know. But being able to use satellite data and get really efficient ways of interpreting that aerial photography is a game changer on getting complete data sets on this sort of stuff, and that's why it's so important. And then Matteo, very thought-provoking, I thought. I come from an urban ecology background. I worked for 10 years in the 90s with the London Ecology Unit, and it was all about, you know, nature connection and opportunities and making green space in urban areas as biodiverse as possible. And it's funny, you know, I go back all that way, and now it's obviously the mission is still there because green infrastructure needs to be to do that dual land use as much as possible. Okay, you know, there's problems there because densification in urban areas is always going to be preferable over greenfield developments. But you know, you need to factor this stuff in at a very early stage in planning. So thanks for that. Yeah. So all it remains for me to do really is to say thanks to certainly Royal Holloway. Are you representing Royal Holloway? Sarah, well, if so, I'm looking at you. Thanks for hosting us here. It's wonderful to have this special relationship with Royal Holloway, and long may that continue. To all our speakers, certainly, thanks very much indeed for coming along, talking about your work with us, and especially to Vicky for organising all this. even though she got the, well, I won't go. We had a lovely lunch, Vicky. It was super, and plenty of it as well. Yeah. So thanks. Very interdisciplinary overview of all the work we've been doing over the last couple of years, which is great.